The first thing you notice is the light. It doesn't arrive in the sudden, mechanical way of an alarm clock or the glow of a phone's screen. Instead, the morning sun seeps gradually into the room, filtering through the uneven gaps of rough, cut timber walls. The beams are soft and golden, carrying with them a faint warmth that feels both comforting and unfamiliar. This is not the world you left behind. This is the frontier, sometime in the 1870s, and the day begins with the rising of the sun. Whether you are ready or not, you lie for a moment longer listening. The cabin around you creaks with the settling of wood. From outside comes the muffled call of a rooster, somewhere in the distance, followed by the low rumble of a wagon wheel bumping over dirt. There is no hum of electricity, no plumbing rushing through pipes, no background noise of engines. The silence is profound, broken only by the small natural sounds of a world that is very much alive. Your bed is simple. A wooden frame supports a straw-filled mattress, covered with coarse linen. It's not comfortable in the way you might expect. The straw shifts beneath you, leaving certain spots uneven, and the cloth scratches slightly against your skin. Yet for most people here, this is a perfectly ordinary place to sleep. Some cabins had only blankets spread directly on the floorboards, and others shared their bedding with several family members, or with the occasional unwelcome insect guest. The mattress may leave your shoulders sore, but compared to nothing at all, it's a small luxury. The air is cool this morning. Without insulation or central heating, the cabin holds onto the night's chills. You can see your breath faintly when you exhale, a thin cloud that lingers for just a second before vanishing. If this is winter, the air would be far sharper, sometimes dropping well below freezing inside these small homes. If it is summer, then later in the day you'll feel the opposite stifling heat that seeps into every corner. On the frontier, the seasons were constant companions, and there was little protection from them beyond fire in winter and shade in summer. You shift and sit up slowly. The wooden floor beneath your bare feet is dusty and cool. A pair of boots waits nearby. But before slipping them on, most frontier people develop the habit of shaking them out carefully. Snakes or scorpions, seeking shelter in the night, sometimes found their way into warm leather. It was a small precaution, but an important one. The cabin itself is plain, though not without a certain rustic charm. The walls are made from logs fitted together, chinked with mud to keep out drafts. The roof is pitched steeply to let rain and snow slide off, though leaks are common. A small table sits near the fireplace, which is little more than a stone hearth blackened by years of smoke. A shelf holds a few utensils, perhaps a tin plate, a metal cup, and a single iron pot. Tools are scattered neatly along one wall: an axe, a shovel, and a few handmade items that would be put to use before the day is done. Outside the window, the land stretches wide. If you're near the plains, the grass ripples like a great golden ocean under the wind. If you're closer to the mountains, the peaks rise in the distance, bluish in the morning haze. The sky feels enormous, stretching endlessly above, unbroken by tall buildings or wires. For settlers of the 19th century, this expanse was both inspiring and intimidating. It offered promise, but also reminded them how small and vulnerable human beings could feel in such open space. The morning routine on the frontier is simple, but constant. There is water to fetch if you are lucky enough to have a well nearby. Otherwise, it means walking to a stream, carrying buckets that grow heavier with each step back. Water is precious, used carefully for drinking and cooking long before anyone thought about bathing with it. Once the water is brought in, a fire is coaxed back to life. Embers from the night before are stirred, coaxed with dry twigs, until flames catch and spread warmth through the cabin. Breakfast is not elaborate. Perhaps a pot of beans simmered slowly, or hard biscuits baked days earlier. Coffee, if you have it, is boiled directly over the fire. It tastes strong and sometimes bitter, but it provides comfort at the start of the day. Milk might be available if a cow is kept, but fruit is rare, vegetables rarer still. The diet is simple, meant to fill the stomach rather than delight the senses. And yet, in this moment, as the morning sun creeps higher and the smell of firewood and coffee mingle, it has a quiet charm of its own. As you sit, eating slowly, the sounds of the frontier town, or perhaps just the scattered homesteads nearby, begin to reach your ears. A hammer striking wood as someone repairs a fence. A horse neighing as it is led out of the stable. The faint murmur of voices carried by the wind. People are already at work, for life here allows little idleness. Each day is a sequence of tasks, small steps that together keep a family alive in a place that demands much and gives only what is earned. And yet there is a rhythm to it, a rhythm that is slower than what you may know, but steady and grounding. The day is not dictated by clocks or schedules, but by the movement of the sun across the sky. Morning is a time to prepare, to take stock of what lies ahead. The world outside might be harsh and demanding, but within the quiet of this cabin, the morning still feels gentle. You rise, stretching a little, feeling the stiffness in your back and shoulders from yesterday's work, or perhaps from the straw mattress itself. There is no rush, only the knowledge that the day will not wait. Soon you will step outside and face the expanse of the frontier, but for now, you are here, in this simple cabin, with the slow light of dawn easing you into the experience of another day. As the last of your coffee warms your hands, you pause and take one more long look around. The cabin is humble, the food plain, the labor ahead certain. But there is also something grounding about this life. It is not glamorous, not heroic, but it is deeply human. A steady rhythm of survival, of waking with the sun and of beginning each day again. The day has begun, and with it comes the steady rhythm of tasks that define frontier life. On the American frontier of the 1870s, mornings were not leisurely stretches of time to be enjoyed in comfort. They were practical, purposeful, and filled with small duties that, together, kept a household functioning. To step into a settler's morning is to step into a world where every action had weight and every choice shaped survival. You begin by tending to the fire. The hearth, often the heart of a cabin, has burned low during the night. If you are fortunate, a few glowing embers remain beneath the ash. Settlers quickly learned the art of nursing these faint sparks back to life, adding small sticks of dry kindling, leaning close and breathing gently until flames catch. A fire was never taken for granted. Without it, there was no warmth against the morning chill, no way to prepare food, and no light once evening returned. Fetching water comes next. The bucket is heavy, its handle worn smooth by daily use. If there is a well on the property, the task may be as simple as lowering the rope and hauling it back up. But in many places, water must be carried from a stream or river, sometimes half a mile or more away. Imagine the steady walk there, the crunch of dirt beneath your boots, the sound of wind moving across the prairie or through the trees. On the return journey, the weight of the water pulls at your arms, a reminder of how precious each drop is. Once the water is brought in, it is divided carefully, a portion for cooking, a portion for drinking, some set aside for washing hands or rinsing tools. Bathing rarely figures into the routine. The water is too valuable to use for such luxuries, and most settlers adapted to going long stretches with only a quick rinse or a sponge bath when possible. For now, the focus is on immediate needs. Breakfast is plain but comforting in its own way. Perhaps beans left to cook overnight in the pots, flavored with salt pork if available, maybe cornmeal mush stirred slowly into hot water until it thickens into a simple porridge. Biscuits, made from flour, lard, and a little baking powder, are often baked in iron pans set directly in the hearth. Coffee, strong and often boiled for too long, is poured into tin cups. It is not the rich, fragrant coffee of modern cafes, but it offers warmth and energy for the day ahead. Children, if present, wake quickly to the sound of voices and the smell of foods. Their chores begin early too. A boy may be sent to feed the chickens or check on livestock. A girl might help gather kindling or sweep the cabin floor. Age is no shield from responsibilities. Even young children contributed what they could. A child might carry water, collect eggs, or help knead bread. On the frontiers, work was part of life from the earliest years. Animals require attention before anything else. If you own cows, they must be milked. Horses need feeding and grooming before they can be used. Chickens must be fed and their coops secured. These morning tasks form a quiet connection between humans and animals. Not sentimental, but practical, each depending on the other for survival. The steady rhythm of brushing a horse's coat or pouring grain into a trough becomes part of the music of the morning. Laundry, when undertaken, is an all-day task that often begins in the morning. Water must be heated, soap prepared, and clothing scrubbed by hand against washboards. It is heavy work often left to women and done only when absolutely necessary. More often, clothing was worn repeatedly before washing, patched and mended until it could no longer serve its purpose. The smell of smoke from the hearth often lingered in fabrics, as did the dust of the trails outside. The cabin itself also requires care. Floors are swept to push away dust and dirt carried in from outside. Ashes are cleared from the hearth and sometimes scattered outdoors. Tools and utensils are checked, mended if needed, or returned to their places. On the frontier, order was not a matter of decoration but of efficiency. To know where an axe or shovel was kept might save time, and time could make the difference in an emergency. For many settlers, morning also included tending to small gardens. Rows of beans, corn, or squash might need watering or weeding. In spring, seedlings required careful protection against late frosts. In summer, plants needed constant attention to keep them from being overtaken by weeds. These gardens, though modest, provided crucial additions to the otherwise limited diet of bread, beans, and salted meat. If you listen closely, the sounds of the wider community begin to stir as well. From the distance comes the faint strike of a hammer, someone repairing a fence posts, the neigh of horses being hitched to wagons, perhaps the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer if a town lies nearby. The morning is alive not with machines, but with the physical rhythm of hands, tools, and voices. By now, the sun is higher, casting long shadows across the prairie or forest floor. Light streams in through the cracks of the cabin, illuminating dust motes that float lazily in the air. The work is steady, unhurried yet unending. Each small duty blends into the next, forming the foundation of a day that will be filled with greater tasks: ploughing, mending fences, chopping wood, or traveling to towns. But the morning sets the tone. It is quiet, practical, and grounding. A reminder that survival here is not built on grand gestures, but on the patient completion of small, repeated acts. For modern ears, the morning routine of a settler might seem harsh, even monotonous. Yet there is also a certain peace in its simplicity. There are no blaring alarms, no rush of traffic, no endless notifications demanding attention. There is only the rising of the sun, the warmth of the hearth, the creak of wood, and the steady flow of tasks that carry you gently into the day. As the last of the breakfast is finished, and the tools of the morning put away, the settler prepares for the true labor to come. Muscles are already awake, warmed by movement, and the mind is set on the challenges ahead. There is no illusion that the day will be easy, but there is also no question of whether it must be faced. On the frontier, each morning is a new beginning, a fresh chance to shape life out of a demanding landscape. And so, with the sun now climbing higher into the wide, endless sky, the morning routine draws to a close. The embers of the hearth glow, the animals are fed, the water is set aside. The cabin is ready, and so are you. The day stretches out before you, waiting. When you think of the Wild West, it's easy to imagine sizzling steaks cooked over an open fire or hearty meals served in bustling saloons. The truth, however, was far more modest. On the frontier, food was not about indulgence or variety. It was about survival, plain, filling meals that could be stretched as far as possible. For many, The day's rhythm was measured as much by hunger as by the rising and setting of the sun. The foundation of the frontier diet was simplicity. Flour, beans, cornmeal, salt, coffee, and sometimes dried meat formed the staples of most households. If you were lucky enough to live near a settlement with a general store, you could purchase these goods in bulk, often in large cloth sacks or barrels. A single bag of flour might be expected to last a family weeks, carefully rationed into biscuits, bread, and dumplings. Beans, soaked overnight and boiled for hours, appeared on tables day after day. Cornmeal, ground coarse and golden, was cooked into mush, baked into cornbread, or fried into simple cakes. Salt was precious, not just for flavor but for preservation. Meat could be packed in salt to keep it from spoiling, though the process left it tough and briny. Coffee, though harsh and sometimes bitter, was a small comfort and one of the few luxuries that settlers clung to. Many boiled it directly in iron pots, grounds and all, producing a dark, strong brew that was more functional than enjoyable. Fresh food was harder to come by. Vegetables, when grown in small gardens, added welcome variety, but the growing season was short and the yields uncertain. Potatoes, onions, and squash stored well and became reliable companions through the colder months. Fruits, if gathered wild or traded, were eaten quickly or dried for later use. Apples, when available, could be sliced and left to dry in the sun, preserved for winter in baskets or cloth sacks. Meat was less common than one might expect. Hunting could provide venison, rabbit, or wild fowls, but success was never guaranteed. Ammunition was expensive, and wild game grew scarce near larger settlements. Families often relied instead on livestock, chickens for eggs, pigs for occasional slaughter, and cows for milk. A chicken might be eaten on a Sunday or a special occasion, but most of the time it was kept for eggs, which could be gathered daily and used in baking. Pork fat, rendered into lard, was invaluable for cooking and for stretching scarce ingredients into filling meals. Breakfast, for many settlers, was the most substantial meal of the day. A pot of beans simmered overnight might be ladled into bowls, perhaps with a crust of bread to soak up the broth. Cornmeal mush, eaten with a little molasses if it could be afforded, was another common choice. Coffee warmed the hands and the stomach, preparing the body for long hours of labor. Sometimes bacon or salt pork was added, its smoky flavor turning a plain meal into a small comfort. Midday meals were lighter, often little more than leftovers from breakfast. Bread and beans, cold if no fire was available, filled the gap until evenings. Those working in the fields or on long journeys might carry a piece of dried meat, a biscuit, or even a lump of cheese if it could be spared. Food was functional, meant to sustain rather than delight. Supper, eaten after the day's work was done, might resemble breakfast. Beans again, or cornbread, or a stew made from whatever could be gathered. Stews were common because they allowed small amounts of meat or vegetables to be stretched into something more filling. A rabbit, a handful of carrots, and some potatoes could feed a family if simmered slowly with water and a little salt. The fragrance of a stew, drifting from a cabin hearth or a campfire pot, was one of the quiet comforts of frontier life. For those who traveled, cowboys, wagon trains, or soldiers, food was even more limited. Hardtack, a simple biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, was baked until nearly indestructible. It could last for months, though it was so hard it sometimes had to be soaked in coffee or stew before eating. Jerky, dried strips of beef or buffalo, was another common travel food. Though tough, it provided protein that could be carried long distances without spoiling. Preservation was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, settlers used smokehouses to cure meat, cellars to keep vegetables cool, and jars to preserve fruit with sugar or vinegar. Pickles, jams, and dried goods helped bridge the gap between seasons. A well-stocked cellar was a sign of careful planning, and sometimes the difference between comfort and hunger during a hard winter. Treats, though rare, held special meaning. Molasses honey, or a bit of sugar transformed ordinary cornbread into something sweet. Children might be given a piece of rock candy or a baked apple as a reward. Holidays, when neighbors gathered and shared what they had, were often marked by pies, cakes, or roast meats, foods that felt luxurious precisely because they were not part of everyday life. The act of eating on the frontier was rarely about ceremony. Meals were taken at rough tables, often with mismatched utensils or tin plates. Food was shared quickly, without the luxury of lingering. Yet, despite the plainness of the fare, there was a certain satisfaction in it. A bowl of beans after a long day's labor filled the belly, warmed the body, and reminded settlers of the small, but steady progress of survival. Imagine yourself there, sitting at a simple wooden table as the evening sun fades. Before you is a bowl of stew, steam rising gently in the cool air. The bread beside it is coarse but warm. The fire crackles softly, casting a glow on the cabin walls. Outside, the sounds of animals settling for the night drift through the air. The lowing of cattle, the rustle of chickens, the quiet sigh of wind through the grass. The meal is not extravagant, but it is enough. In the quiet rhythm of frontier life, food provided more than nourishment. It was a reminder of effort, of labor turned into sustenance. Each bean boiled, each loaf baked, each potato dug from the ground was part of a larger story. The story of people making a life in a place where nothing came easily, yet where every bite carried the taste of persistence and resilience. And so, the frontier diet, plain though it may seem, was not without its meaning. It bound families together at the table, gave strength for long days of work, and offered comfort in the simplest of ways. It was a diet built not on indulgence, but on endurance, steady groundings, and deeply tied to the land itself. Clothing on the frontier was not about fashion. It was about practicality, durability, and making do with what was available. To live in the Wild West meant facing heat, cold winds, and dust without the protections of modern fabrics or conveniences. Each article of clothing was chosen with care, often worn until it could no longer be patched, and carried with it the marks of labor, weather, and time. When you first rise in the morning, the process of getting dressed is guided less by personal choice and more by necessity. For men, the usual outfit consisted of wool or cotton trousers, a long-sleeved shirt, suspenders to hold everything in place, and sturdy boots. The colors were plain: browns, grays, and faded blues, chosen not for style but because they hid dirt and dust welts. A wide-brimmed hat was almost essential, shielding the eyes from the blinding sun and offering some protection from rains. Women's clothing was layered and practical, though heavy by modern standards. A long dress, often made of cotton calicoes, reached down to the ankles. Aprons were worn to protect the dress from cooking or farm works. Beneath the outer layer were petticoats and sometimes a corset, though many frontier women set such garments aside when hard work demanded freedom of movement. Bonnets shielded the face and neck from the sun, while shawls or woolen wraps provided warmth in cooler weather. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothing, often hand-me-downs passed from older siblings. Boys might be seen in simple shirts and trousers held up with suspenders, while girls wore plain dresses and pinafores. Few families could afford to buy new garments frequently. Instead, clothes were patched and mended repeatedly, the fabric showing stitches upon stitches, each telling a small story of endurance. Shoes were among the most precious possessions. Boots were made of leather, thick and stiff, meant to withstand long days of walking, riding, or working outdoors. They were polished and repaired when possible, but when they finally wore through, replacements were not easy to come by. Some settlers went barefoot during the warmer months to save wear on their shoes, their feet toughened by daily contact with dirt paths and wooden floors. The materials available shaped what people wore. Cottons, when it could be purchased or traded, was a common choice for everyday wear. Wool, warmer but heavier, was used for winter clothing. Leather, from cattle or deer, was fashioned into coats, vests, and boots. Homespun cloth woven by hand on small looms added to the supplies. In remote areas, families grew flax or sheep for wool, spinning and weaving their own garments out of necessity. Laundry was a major undertaking, and not something done daily. Clothes were worn again and again before being washed, especially work garments. When wash day did arrive, it was often a Monday, and it consumed the entire day. Buckets of water were heated over the fire, soap was grated and mixed, and garments were scrubbed against wooden washboards until the fabric grew thin. Clothes were then wrung out by hand and hung on lines or spread across bushes to dry in the sun. By evening, arms ached and backs were sore, but the family had a stack of clean garments, smelling faintly of lye soap and fresh air. Comfort, as we know it today, was scarce. There were no wardrobes filled with options, no soft fabrics designed for relaxation. A single outfit might serve for weeks, patched and worn until nearly threadbare. Woolen blankets provided warmth at night, layered heavily in winter, while in summer, sleep came under light sheets or sometimes none at all when the air grew too hot to bear. Yet, despite the plainness of frontier clothing, there was also care taken in its upkeep. Women embroidered small patterns on aprons or collars, brightening otherwise simple garments. Men polished their boots when they could, and boys treasured hats passed down from fathers or uncles. On Sundays, or during community gatherings, families dressed in their best. A dress with fewer patches, a shirt freshly pressed, a hat brushed clean. These small efforts gave dignity to lives otherwise marked by labor. Travelers and workers adapted their clothing to the demands of their environment. Cowboys wore denim trousers, leather chaps to protect against brush, and broad hats that shaded them during long rides. Miners dressed in wool shirts and tough boots, clothing that could withstand rough conditions underground. Farmers favored suspenders and wide-brimmed straw hats, practical for long days under the sun. Clothing told a story of occupation as much as it did of place. The seasons dictated further changes. In winter, every scrap of warmth was gathered. Scarves, mittens, and heavy coats were handmade or traded. Quilts, layered thickly, became essential. In summer, the sun beat down relentlessly, and lighter cotton garments became a necessity, though even then the heat clung. Bonnets, hats, and long sleeves helped shield skin from the harshness of the sun, not only to preserve appearance, but also to prevent painful burns. For many, comfort came not from the fabric itself, but from familiarity. A patched coat that had served through 3 winters was trusted. A pair of boots that molded to the shape of the foot became almost like an extension of the body. Clothes were not objects to be replaced lightly, they were companions through seasons of hardship and labor. If you picture yourself stepping outside a frontier cabin in the morning, dressed as a settler, you might feel the weight of the garments against your shoulders, the stiffness of leather boots, the sun pressing down against the brim of your hat. You might notice the wind tugging at your shawls, or the dust clinging to your trousers as you walk along the path. These clothes are not designed for ease, but for endurance, for weathering the world just as surely as the people who wore them. And when the day is done, and garments are set aside by the hearths, their presence remains. A pair of boots drying by the fire, a dress folded carefully over a chair, a child's cap left on the table. Each one is a reminder of life lived simply but steadily, of people who dressed not for styles, but for survival, carrying their comforts in the resilience of fabric worn thin by countless days of use. Life on the frontier was shaped as much by the weather as by work. In a world without modern heating, air conditioning, or reliable forecasts, the elements were constant companions. Settlers rose with the sun and endured whatever the sky delivered, from blistering heat to sudden storms, from freezing winters to endless winds that swept across the plains. To live in the Wild West was to live in dialogue with nature, accepting its moods and adjusting daily life to its rhythm. The first thing you might notice when stepping outside is the sky. on the frontiers. It feels impossibly wide, stretching in every direction without interruption. Clouds drift lazily one day and gather dark and heavy the next, threatening rain or hail. The horizon seems to go on forever, and in that vastness you feel both free and exposed. There is no shelter from the weather beyond what you build yourself, and no certainty about what tomorrow will bring. Summers were often harsh. On the open plains, the sun beat down relentlessly, its heat radiating off the earth until even the air shimmered. Days could feel endless, filled with the steady hum of insects and the crackle of dry grass underfoot. Shade was rare, except beneath a lone tree or the sloping roof of a cabin. Many settlers covered their heads with wide, brimmed hats and draped cloths across their necks to protect themselves from the sun. Water became precious in these months, and long walks to wells or streams felt heavier with each step under the blazing skies. With summer also came sudden storms. Dark clouds could appear quickly, rolling across the prairie like a moving wall. Lightning forked across the sky, and thunder followed with a force that shook the ground. Rain poured in heavy sheets, soaking everything within minutes. Cabins leaked, dirt paths turned to mud, and livestock grew restless. Yet, for many, these storms were also a relief, breaking the oppressive heat and filling barrels with water for later use. Winter, by contrast, brought cold that could settle deep into the bones. Snow blanketed the grounds, sometimes so heavily that doors were blocked and wagons could not pass. Inside cabins, families huddled close to the hearths, feeding it with logs chopped and stacked carefully in the warmer months. Windows frosted over, and breath lingered in the air even indoors. Blankets and quilts were layered thickly at night, and still the cold crept in through cracks in the walls. Work did not stop entirely, animals needed care, and water had to be fetched. But much of life in winter revolved around conserving warmth and supplies until spring returns. The winds were a constant, particularly on the open prairie. They carried dust that stung the eyes, rattled loose boards on cabins, and whistled through any gap in the walls. The sound of wind became part of daily life, a low, steady presence that seemed to sing across the land. At times, the gusts were strong enough to topple small outbuildings or scatter belongings. Children learned to chase after hats caught by the breeze, and women pinned their bonnets tightly beneath their chins to keep them from blowing away. Rain was both blessing and challenge. In springs, it nourished crops and filled streams, bringing a sense of renewal after the long winter. Yet too much rain could wash out roads, flood low cabins, and rot food stores. Families often dug drainage ditches around their homes, hoping to divert the water. A steady drizzle might last for days, soaking clothing hung outside and turning fields into sticky mud. The smell of damp earth filled the air, clinging to everything. Drought, on the other hand, was among the greatest fears. Weeks without rain meant crops withered, animals grew thin, and wells dried. Dust coated the mouth and cracked the skin. Every cloudless day stretched patience thinner, and prayers for rain became more frequent. For settlers who relied entirely on what the land could provide, the absence of water was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat to survival itself. Seasonal transitions carried their own challenges. Spring thaw turned frozen ground into mud, wheels sinking deep and boots caked with soil. Rivers swelled with melting snow, sometimes making crossings dangerous. Autumn brought crisp air and brilliant colors, but also the urgent reminder that winter was near. Firewood had to be gathered and stored, crops harvested and preserved, repairs made to cabins before the snow arrived. Each season carried work that prepared for the next, creating a cycle that repeated year after year. Despite the hardships, there was also beauty in the elements. Sunsets stretched in long ribbons of red and gold across the horizon, unbroken by buildings or smokes. Fresh snow sparkled under moonlight, turning the landscape into a silent, glowing world. After a storm, the air smelled sharp and clean. The sky scrubbed bright with clarity. Even the winds, for all their relentlessness, carried with them a kind of music, a reminder of the vast, untamed nature of the land. Comfort against the weather was limited, but people adapted. Quilts were stitched from scraps of old clothing, layered thickly for warmth. Oilcloths covered windows to block drafts. In summer, cabins were left open to catch breezes, and water was drawn and stored carefully. Clothing was chosen with the seasons in mind. Wool and leather for the cold, cotton for the heat, and always a hat to shield against the sun. Imagine yourself stepping outside on a frontier morning, the air cool and damp after a night of rains. The ground squelches beneath your boots and the smell of wet earth surrounds you. Or picture a winter night, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of the fire, frost slowly creeping across the window panes. In each moment, the weather is not just background, it is a central part of life, demanding attention, shaping choices, and reminding you of the land's power. To live in the Wild West was to live without control over the elements, but not without respect for them. Settlers learned to adapt, to endure, and to find small comforts where they could. A quilt against the cold, a cup of water in the heat, a moment of quiet or a sky that stretched endlessly above them. Weather was not an obstacle to overcome but a companion to live alongside, day after day, season after season. When you imagine the Wild West, perhaps your mind calls up images of cowboys in wide, brimmed hats, guns strapped at their sides, boots polished from wear, or women in elegant gowns like those in old films. The reality, however, was far plainer. Clothing on the frontier was not about fashion but survival. Every item served a purpose, chosen less for its beauty and more for its durability, its warmth and practicality. Men and women alike often owned only a handful of garments. Many settlers might have just one set of work clothes, and a second set saved for Sunday church services or special gatherings. This simplicity wasn't merely a matter of choice. Cloth was expensive, and the long distances between settlements meant fabric or ready-made clothing was difficult to acquire. Every garment had to last as long as possible, often patched and mended repeatedly, until it was more stitching than original cloth. For men, clothing typically consisted of sturdy trousers, often made of canvas or denim. Shirts were usually cotton or wool, depending on the seasons, and were plain in design. No frills, just functional garments that could endure hours of labor. Vests and suspenders were common, not for style but to keep everything in place during long days of work. Coats, when available, were made from heavy wool or animal hides, worn until they were threadbare. Footwear was usually leather boots, designed for durability but often uncomfortable. Settlers might stuff them with straw or cloth to fill worn holes or to provide a bit of warmth. Women's clothing was far more restrictive by modern standards. Layers were the expectation: chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that brushed against the dirt. Even in the blazing heat of summer, women were expected to maintain these layers, their movements slowed by fabric and boning. Dresses were often made at home, stitched from whatever fabric was available, and worn until patches covered nearly every surface. Aprons were worn daily, not as an accessory, but as protection for dresses during cooking, cleaning, or fieldwork. A torn apron was far easier to replace than a dress. Children, too, were dressed in simple, sturdy clothes, often hand-me-downs from older siblings. Little boys might wear loose shirts and trousers held up with suspenders, while girls wore scaled-down versions of adult dresses. Because fabric was so precious, garments were continually altered to fit as children grew. A dress might start long and be hemmed higher, then pass to a younger child once it became too short. Nothing was wasted. Washing clothes was an ordeal in itself. Without running water or electricity, laundry meant hauling buckets of water from a well or stream, heating it over a fire, and scrubbing each garment by hand on a washboard. Soap was often homemade from lion animal fat, harsh on the skin and fabric alike. After scrubbing, clothing had to be wrung out and hung to dry in the open air. This was a full day's work, often left to women. And so washing was done sparingly. It was not unusual for people to wear the same garments for weeks, especially in winter, when water was frozen and washing outdoors nearly impossible. Because of these challenges, frontier communities rarely smelled fresh or clean. Sweat, smoke, and the natural wear of heavy labor left their marks on every garment. Bathing was infrequent, and clothing absorbed the scents of the environment. Wood smoke from the hearth, manure from livestock, and the sharp tang of sweat from fieldwork. These smells became a normal part of life, hardly noticed after a while. Hats were perhaps the most essential piece of attire, particularly for men. Wide-brimmed hats shielded faces from the burning sun and provided a degree of shelter from rains. They also served as makeshift buckets for carrying water or as fans on hot days. Boots were another necessity, though often ill-fitting or worn thin. Settlers valued them highly, sometimes repairing the same pair for years because replacing them was costly. On special occasions, weddings, funerals, dances, or church services, people would wear their best, often the only fine clothing they owned. For men, this might mean a dark suit, carefully brushed and rarely worn to preserve its condition. For women, it meant a carefully kept dress, perhaps trimmed with lace or ribbons if they could afford it. These garments were often handmade with extra care, sometimes handed down through generations. For many, their Sunday best was the most valuable possession they owned outside of their tools. Appearances, though plain, carried weight in frontier communities. Cleanliness and neatness, even if difficult to maintain, were seen as signs of respectability. A man who showed up to church in dirty clothes might be judged as lazy, while a woman with a well-kept dress signaled care and responsibility. In towns, businesses often expected men to wear a coat and women to appear in full dresses, regardless of the weather. Social expectations could be heavy, even in an environment where comfort was scarce. Personal grooming was equally limited. Razors were reused until they dulled, and shaving was a slow process without modern conveniences. Beards were common, not as a fashion, but as a practical solution. Women's hairstyles were elaborate in theory, but on the frontier, hair was usually tied back simply, braided, or pinned in place to keep it out of the way during work. Hair washing was infrequent, often done with homemade soap that left it coarse. Despite this, hair was considered a point of pride, and women devoted time to brushing and caring for it when possible. Imagine yourself in such attire: the stiffness of canvas trousers, the scratch of a wool shirt against your skin, or the weight of a dress with multiple layers. The clothing, though simple, becomes part of the rhythm of life, shaping how you move and how you feel. On cold days, the layers protect you. On hot days, they trap the heat until sweat clings to your skin. Each item tells a story of resourcefulness, endurance, and adaptation to a world where nothing could be wasted. In truth, the clothing of the Wild West was less about the myth of rugged fashion and more about endurance. Each patch sewn into a sleeve, each faded apron tied at the waist, each carefully brushed coat worn to church was a quiet symbol of survival. Life was measured in what could be made to last, and clothing was no exception. Step through the rough wooden door of a frontier cabin, and you find yourself in a space that is at once simple and essential. These cabins were rarely larger than a single room, built quickly from logs, sod, or whatever material the land provided. They were not designed for comfort in the modern sense, but for necessity. A roof to keep out the rain, walls to block the wind, and a hearth to provide heat. Yet within these modest structures, families lived entire lives, shaping routines and memories inside spaces that today might feel impossibly small. The air inside such a cabin carried the scent of wood smoke, earth and labor. Walls were often left rough, logs fitted together with gaps filled by clay or mud. In some homes, daylight slipped through these cracks, and on stormy nights, water sometimes did as well. The floors were dirt at first, later sometimes covered with rough planks when families had time or resources. Every part of the cabin was built by hand, each beam lifted, each nail hammered, often with neighbors helping one another raise walls in a day of shared work. Space was precious. A single room had to serve as kitchen, bedroom, dining room, and gathering place. Beds were pushed against the walls, often no more than wooden frames filled with straw or corn husks. A table stood in the center, sturdy and plain, surrounded by mismatched chairs or stools. In one corner, shelves might hold a few treasured possessions, a Bible, a family photograph, or a jar of precious sugar. Another corner was dominated by the hearth, the heart of the cabin, where meals were cooked and warmth was provided. The hearth was more than just a place for fire. It was the center of daily life. Cooking was done in heavy iron pots, hung on hooks or set directly into the flames. Bread baked slowly, meat roasted when it was available, and stews simmered for hours, filling the small space with warmth and scent. In winter, families gathered close to the fire, talking softly, mending clothes, or simply resting after long days of labor. The flickering light painted shadows across the walls, turning the cabin into a place of quiet refuge even as winds howled outside. Furnishings were sparse, often handmade from whatever wood could be found. A rocking chair, if one existed, was a luxury. Most families owned only what they needed: a table, a few chairs, beds, perhaps a chest for clothing. Storage was limited and possessions were few. Quilts, stitched from scraps of old fabric, added color to the otherwise plain interior, each patch carrying its own history. Curtains, if present, were often made of simple muslin or flour sacks. Everything had a purpose, and nothing was wasted. Daily life inside the cabin followed the rhythm of work. In the mornings, light filtered through small windows, and families rose early to begin chores. Meals were eaten quickly, dishes washed in basins of water carried from outside. Children played in corners or helped with small tasks. Evenings were quieter, filled with the sound of crackling fires, the scratching of pens on paper if anyone kept a journal, or the faint hum of a lullaby as children were put to bed. Privacy was scarce. In a one-room cabin, parents and children slept in the same space, separated only by quilts hung as curtains if materials allowed. Conversations, laughter, and arguments were all shared, with little opportunity for solitude. Families learned to live closely together, their lives interwoven by necessity. For some, this closeness bred warmth and cooperation. For others, it created tension in the tight quarters. The cabins themselves varied depending on region and resources. On the prairie, where trees were scarce, settlers built sod houses. Walls made from thick blocks of earth cut from the ground, stacked carefully, and reinforced with grass roots. These sod homes, though humble, were surprisingly warm in winter and cool in summer, though they often leaked dirt and insects. In wooded areas, log cabins were more common, their walls rough, hewn but sturdy. Each type carried its own challenges, yet both reflected the ingenuity of people making do with what they had. Despite the simplicity, there was also comfort to be found. The sound of rain tapping against the roof, while a fire glowed inside, could bring a deep sense of safety. Quilts layered on a straw bed offered warmth against the cold. Familiar routines, the setting of the tables, the hanging of herbs to dry by the hearths, the sweeping of the floor with a handmade broom, created a sense of order in a world otherwise unpredictable. Entertainment was modest. Families read aloud from the Bible or from the few books they might own. Children played simple games with carved wooden toys or string. Music, when present, was cherished: a fiddle, a harmonica, or simply the sound of voices singing together. In the glow of lamplights, stories were told, sometimes of the past, sometimes of distant lands, each word weaving community within the close walls of the cabins. Illumination came from candles or oil lamps, their flames small but steady. After dark, light was precious and work slowed as shadows deepened. The night pressed close around the cabin, and people adjusted to the natural rhythm of day and night. Early to bed and early to rise was not a saying but a necessity dictated by the limits of daylight. Imagine yourself sitting in such a cabin as evening falls. The air is warm with the scent of stew simmering over the fire. A quilt rests on your lap, its fabric soft from years of use. Outside, the wind moves through the trees, but here inside, the flicker of lamplight creates a circle of gentle calm. Though the space is small, it feels whole, a shelter not only from weather, but from the vastness of the world beyond the walls. Life inside a frontier cabin was far from luxurious, yet it was steady, enduring, and deeply human. In these small rooms, families worked, ate, quarreled, laughed, and dreamed. Every creak of the floor, every wisp of smoke rising from the hearths, every carefully patched quilt carried with it the story of survival. Within these walls, lives were built quietly, day by day, shaping the history of the West not through dramatic moments but through the simple rhythm of living. When most people picture the Wild West, the saloon quickly comes to mind. Films and novels have painted it as the heart of every frontier town, swinging doors, smoky rooms, card games in full swing, and the tense silence before a gunfight. In reality, saloons were far less glamorous. They were functional places, sometimes rough, often plain, and always shaped by the needs of the communities they served. To step inside one was not to enter a scene from a Western movie, but rather to find a mixture of weary travelers, locals seeking company, and the persistent smell of alcohol and tobacco. The exterior of a saloon was usually simple. Wooden planks formed the structures, sometimes painted but more often weathered by wind and sun. A sign out front announced its presence, sometimes with a painted name, other times with nothing more than the word saloon. The iconic swinging doors, while they did exist in some places, were far from universal. Many saloons had ordinary doors or even just open entryways to let in light and air. Inside, the room was dim, the windows often small, and lanterns or oil lamps provided most of the light. The furnishings were plain but sturdy. A long bar, often made of rough wood, stretched along one wall. Behind it stood shelves with bottles of liquor, sometimes imported, but often mixed locally with unpredictable results. Whiskey was the most common drink, though it bore little resemblance to the refined versions known today. It was often strong, harsh, and cut with additives to stretch its quantity. Beer was available in some saloons, though usually served warm, as refrigeration was rare. Tables filled the rest of the space, their surfaces scarred with knife marks and rings from spilled drinks. Wooden chairs creaked as patrons shifted in them, and sawdust was sometimes scattered on the floor to soak up spills. Tobacco smoke lingered heavily in the air, mixing with the sense of sweat and alcohol. The noise level varied at times. Quiet conversation filled the room, while at others laughter, music, or arguments created a restless energy. Card games were a staple. Poker and faro were among the most popular, with players hunched over tables for hours, coins and bills changing hands steadily. Gambling brought excitement but also tension, and disputes were not uncommon. While gunfights in the middle of a card game were more myth than reality, tempers did flare, and saloon keepers sometimes had to step in to restore order. More often, disagreements ended in harsh words rather than drawn weapons. Music, too, played its part in shaping the saloon's atmosphere. A piano, if one could be afforded, sat in a corner, its keys worn from use. Traveling musicians might perform for tips, filling the smoky air with tunes that carried both energy and melancholy. Singings, whether from patrons or hired performers, added to the sense of escape that saloons provided. For many, music was the rare reminder of beauty and leisure in a life otherwise filled with labor. Women were present in saloons, though not usually in the way popular culture has suggested. Some worked as servers or entertainers, while others, in less reputable establishments, were part of a trade that blurred the lines between companionship and survival. Life for these women was difficult, marked by long hours, limited choices, and little safety. Their presence, however, underscored the saloon's role as more than a drinking house. It was a social hub, a place where the isolation of the frontier was momentarily eased. Saloons varied depending on location. In larger towns, some were elaborates, with mirrors behind the bar, chandeliers, and fine woodwork designed to impress. In smaller settlements, a saloon might be little more than a tent or shack, offering rough drinks and a place to sit. Despite these differences, the function remained the same: a space for gathering, talking, and finding relief from the hardships of frontier lives. The clientele was equally varied. Cowboys stopping for a brief rest, miners seeking to spend their earnings, settlers looking for conversations, and travelers passing through all might gather in the same room. Each brought stories, experiences, and needs that shaped the saloon's character. For some, it was a place of camaraderie. For others, it was a risky space where too much drink could lead to trouble. Contrary to the myth of endless violence, saloons were often places of routines. Most evenings passed without drama, filled instead with quiet games, steady drinkings, and conversations that wove together the threads of community. Friendships were formed over shared bottles, business deals were struck at tables, and news spread quickly through the lively chatter. Imagine yourself sitting in such a place. The air is warm and thick with smoke, as the lamplight flickers against the wood, panelled walls, and the murmur of voices surrounds you. A piano plays softly in the corners, the notes mingling with the sound of clinking glasses. At your table, a game of cards unfolds, coins sliding across the worn surface as laughter rises from nearby. The saloon is not glamorous, but it is alive, a crossroads where lives intersect, if only for a moment. To modern eyes, saloons might seem unremarkable, even uncomfortable. Yet on the frontier, they were vital. They provided shelter, warmth, and a rare sense of leisure. They broke the monotony of hard labor and isolation, offering people a place to sit, talk, and feel part of something larger. They were not the centers of constant danger that legends suggest, but rather the humble, imperfect gathering spaces of everyday life in the West. In the end, the saloon was less about spectacle and more about connections. It was where a weary cowboy could rest his boots, a miner could share his earnings, and a lonely traveler could find company for a night. The myths have dressed it in drama, but the truth, while quieter, reveals something deeper. The saloon as a small comfort in a vast and challenging world. The popular image of the Wild West often suggests that danger lurked around every corner, with gunfights erupting daily in dusty streets. In truth, life was less dramatic, though not without its risks. Violence existed, but it was often quieter, more ordinary, and deeply tied to the struggles of survival in a land where resources were scarce and law enforcement was limited. Walking through a frontier town, you might notice how quickly disputes could arise. Arguments over debts, land, or livestock were common, and tempers flared easily in a world where so much depended on fragile possessions. A missing cow, a poorly marked boundary, or a card game gone wrong could spark shouting matches that sometimes escalated. Yet for most people, violence was not the first response. The hard work of daily life left little energy for constant fighting, and most disagreements ended with harsh words rather than weapons. Still, weapons were ever present. Men carried revolvers or rifles, not necessarily as symbols of aggression, but as tools of survival. A firearm might be needed for hunting, protection from wild animals, or defense during travel. In towns, however, many communities established rules about carrying guns. Some required weapons to be left at the edge of town, or checked with the sheriff to prevent reckless violence. The effort to create order reflected the settlers' desire for stability, even in the midst of hardship. Law enforcement was often minimal. A small town might have only a single sheriff or marshal, sometimes aided by a deputy or two. Their responsibilities were broad, ranging from settling disputes to tracking down criminals. Without large forces behind them, they relied on community cooperation, persuasion, and at times sheer determination. Justice was imperfect, shaped as much by circumstance as by law. Courts, when they existed, were makeshifts. Trials could be brief, evidence scarce, and verdicts swift. Juries were made up of townspeople, who often knew the accused personally. In some cases, communities took justice into their own hands through vigilance committees. Formed when people felt the law was too slow or too weak, these committees acted quickly, sometimes harshly, and not always fairly. Their presence underscored both the fragility of order and the determination to create it. Violence also took quieter forms. Feuds between families might stretch on for years, carried through grudges, small acts of revenge, or simmering tension that affected entire communities. In mining camps, disputes over claims could lead to threats, sabotage, or sudden fights. On ranches, competition over grazing land sometimes turned neighbors into rivals. Rarely were these conflicts resolved with dramatic duels, but their impact lingered in unease and division. It is important to remember that most people on the frontier longed for peace. The endless work of farming, herding, or building left little space for constant conflict. Families depended on one another, and neighbors often joined together for barn raisings, harvests, or defense against outside threats. Cooperation was as much a part of frontier life as quarrels were, and it was cooperation that allowed communities to endure. Still, moments of violence did leave their mark. Stories spread quickly, carried from town to town by travelers or newspapers. A shooting in one settlement could become exaggerated into legend, adding to the growing myth of the West as a lawless land. These tales, retold and reshaped, gave birth to the larger-than-life characters we remember today, outlaws, sheriffs, and gunfighters whose real lives were often less glamorous than the legends suggest. Inside the saloon, tempers sometimes boiled over. A card game might end in a fistfight, or a drunken disagreement could spill out into the street. More often than not, however, bystanders or barkeepers intervened before things turned deadly. The majority of saloon visits passed in routine, filled with conversations, drink, and the soft notes of a piano. The violence, when it occurred, was memorable precisely because it was unusual. Imagine yourself walking the quiet streets of a small frontier town at dusk. The air is still, lanterns glow faintly in windows, and the sound of boots echoes on wooden sidewalks. The town feels peaceful. Yet you are aware of the undercurrent of tension, the knowledge that with so little structure, disputes can turn serious. A sheriff might nod as he passes by, watchful but alone. His presence a reminder that law rests heavily on the shoulders of just a few individuals. For those traveling beyond towns, danger took different forms. Highway robbery, while not as common as stories suggest, did occur, particularly along isolated trails. Stagecoaches might be stopped, passengers ordered to hand over valuables. Train robberies, though famous in lore, were rare events that owed their fame to how unusual they were. More often, the real threats were natural, storms, accidents, or illness, rather than bandits hiding behind rocks. The image of daily gunfights in the street is one of the most enduring myths of the Wild West, but in reality, such events were exceedingly rare. Communities valued stability, and most people avoided violence whenever possible. Life was difficult enough without adding unnecessary dangers. Yet the possibility of conflict always hovered in the background, shaping behavior, encouraging caution, and reminding everyone of the thin line between order and chaos. In the end, violence and law in the West were less about constant action and more about balance. A sheriff's steady presence, a neighbor's helping hand, or the quiet agreement to let a grudge fade, all mattered far more than the occasional flash of violence. The frontier was not a place of endless chaos, but a place where people struggled, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to create peace amid hardship. When we think of the West today, it is easy to focus on the drama, but perhaps the quieter truth is more meaningful, that ordinary men and women work tirelessly to build communities, striving for safety and order in a land that offered neither easily. Their efforts, small and steady, form the real story of violence and law in the West, not the gunfights of legend, but the patient work of everyday life. On the frontier, illness and injury were constant possibilities, and medical care was a mixture of ingenuity, tradition, and limited resources. To live in the Wild West was to accept that health could never be taken for granted. A small cut might become infected, a fever might linger without clear cause, and childbirth carried serious risks. Without modern hospitals, settlers relied on what was available: home remedies, traveling doctors, and the strength of the human body itself. Cabins often kept a small supply of household remedies. Herbs grown in gardens or gathered from the land were dried and stored in jars or cloth bags. Chamomile might be brewed into a calming tea. Peppermint used to ease stomach discomfort, and willow bark chewed to relieve pain. Its natural compounds a forerunner of aspirins. Honey was spread on wounds as an antiseptic, and poultices of bread, herbs, or clay were applied to draw out infections. These remedies were not always effective, but they reflected the deep resourcefulness of people living far from professional cares. When illness struck, families often turned first to home cures. A child with a cough might be given syrup made from onion or molasses. A feverish patient might be wrapped in cool cloths or given bitter teas believed to draw out the sickness. Rest, warmth, and prayer were staples of care. The limits of these treatments, however, meant that many ailments lingered, and even minor illnesses could become life-threatening. Doctors did exist on the frontier, though their presence was uneven. In some towns, a physician might maintain a modest office filled with jars of powders, glass bottles, and a few well-worn instruments. In more remote areas, a doctor might arrive only occasionally, traveling by horse or wagon to visit patients spread across miles of countryside. Their training varied. Some had studied at established schools, while others had learned through apprenticeships or self-studies. Treatments ranged from genuinely helpful to entirely experimental, depending on knowledge and resources. Medical tools were few. A doctor might carry a black leather bag containing scalpels, forceps, and needles. Bloodletting, though declining in popularity, was still practiced in some places based on the belief that removing blood could restore balance. Laxatives and tonics were commonly prescribed, often containing ingredients like alcohol, opium, or mercury. These substances sometimes relieved symptoms, but often caused additional problems. Despite these risks, settlers welcomed whatever relief could be found. Midwives played a vital role, particularly for childbirth. With hospitals far away and doctors scarce, women relied on one another for guidance through labor. A midwife's experience, passed down through practice and tradition, was invaluable. She might use herbs to ease pain, boiling water to maintain cleanliness, and steady reassurance to calm an anxious mother. Even with care, childbirth was dangerous, and many women did not survive complications. Yet the midwife's presence offered hope and support where otherwise there might have been none. Injuries were common in daily life. Accidents with axes, falls from horses, and burns from open fires were part of the risks of survival. Broken bones were set with wooden splints, wounds stitched with crude needles, and burns treated with salves of fat or herbs. Recovery often depended more on the body's resilience than on medical intervention. Infection was a constant danger, and without antibiotics, even a small injury could become fatal if not treated carefully. Traveling medicine shows also brought remedies to frontier towns. These shows combined entertainment with the sale of miracle cures, bottles of brightly labeled tonics that promised to cure everything from headaches to tuberculosis. While some contained helpful ingredients like alcohol or herbs, many were little more than flavored water, and some contained dangerous substances. Still, settlers bought them eagerly, hoping for relief in a world where real medical help was scarce. Faith and belief played a role as well. Prayer, blessings, and spiritual rituals were part of the healing process for many families. Communities often came together to support the sick, bringing food, tending fires, or sitting at bedsides during long nights. Illness was not faced alone, but as a shared burden, one more challenge in the collective effort of survival. Imagine yourself in a frontier cabin where illness has arrived. The air is heavy with the scent of boiling herbs. The fire kept burning low for warmth. A patient lies under layers of quilts, their skin flushed with fever. Family members move quietly, bringing water, wringing cloths, offering soft words. Outside, the world continues with its endless demands, but inside the cabins, every focus is on the hope of recovery. The atmosphere is hushed, filled with both worry and care. Despite the hardships, many did survive. Human resilience, combined with careful attention and the occasional success of treatments, meant that not all illnesses ended in tragedies. The body's ability to endure, even in harsh conditions, was remarkable. Each recovery was a small victory, celebrated with relief and gratitude. Looking back, the medicine of the West might seem primitive, but it was also deeply human. It reflected the determination to care for one another, to find solutions in the face of scarcity, and to endure with the tools at hand. It was not perfect, and often it was not enough, but it was what people had, and it was shaped by courage as much as by knowledge. In the quiet spaces of frontier cabins and the modest offices of country doctors, healing was an act of persistence. Every poultice applied, every hand held during fever, every midwife's calm guidance was part of the story of survival. Medicine in the Wild West was not only about remedies and risks, but about the human effort to bring comfort and hope where little else was possible. When you imagine meals in the Wild West, it is easy to picture sizzling steaks cooked over a campfire or hearty feasts in rustic taverns. The truth was less dramatic, but every bit as telling of frontier life. Food was never just about taste. It was about survival, practicality, and making the most of what was available. Each meal reflected the challenges of distance, scarcity, and hard work. The foundation of frontier dining was simplicity. Beans, bread, and coffee appeared on tables more often than not. These staples were inexpensive, portable, and long-lasting. A pot of beans might simmer over a fire for hours, providing nourishment with little effort. Bread came in the form of biscuits or cornbread, quick to prepare and filling enough to carry laborers through long days. Coffee, though often bitter and brewed until nearly undrinkable, was a comfort many settlers clung to. Meat was part of the diet, but not always in the abundance that popular images suggest. Fresh beef or pork was a luxury for many families. Instead, meat was preserved with salt or smoke to prevent spoilage. This meant that meals often included heavily salted cuts, tough in texture but rich in protein. Hunters supplemented the diet with wild game, deer, rabbits, turkeys, and in some regions buffalo. These additions brought variety when successful, though hunting required time and skill. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal treasures. A garden, if one could be maintained, provided corn, beans, squash, and greens in warmer months. Apples, berries, or melons might appear briefly during harvest seasons. Preserving these foods for winter was a constant concern. Families dried fruit, pickled cucumbers, and stored root vegetables in cool cellars. Even with preparations, the colder months often meant long stretches without fresh produce. The lack of variety led to nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by a shortage of vitamin C, was not uncommon. Settlers learned to value any food that could prevent such illnesses, even if it meant enduring sour or unfamiliar tastes. Vinegar-based pickles, wild plants, and occasionally imported citrus helped guard against these dangers when available. Cooking methods were practical rather than refined. Meals were often prepared over open fires, using cast iron pots, skillets, and Dutch ovens. These heavy, durable tools could withstand high heat and last for decades. A pot of stew or soup was a common way to stretch ingredients, combining meat, vegetables, and beans into a filling dish. Bread baked in Dutch ovens beneath hot coals carried a smoky flavor that became part of the frontier experience. In towns, dining offered more options, but still carried the marks of scarcity. A restaurant might be nothing more than a home, where meals were served to paying customers. Menus were short, often determined by what the proprietor could obtain. Steaks, stews, and pies appeared when supplies allowed. The quality varied widely. Some meals were hearty and satisfying, others were barely palatable, with overcooked vegetables or meat on the edge of spoiling. General stores also shaped the dining experience. Shelves held canned goods, dried fruits, flour, sugars, and coffee, all priced higher than in the East due to the cost of transports. A can of peaches or a sack of sugar could feel like a luxury purchase reserved for special occasions. Settlers made careful choices, balancing cost with necessity, always mindful of how long supplies had to last. On cattle drives and long journeys, chuck wagons provided sustenance. The cook, often called cookie, managed the supplies and prepared meals for the crews. These meals were practical: beans, biscuits, salted meat, and coffee formed the core diet. Occasionally, the cook might serve dried fruit or cobbled together desserts, but luxury was rare. The cook's role was respected, for a well-fed crew was more likely to endure the hardships of the trail. Alcohol also had its place in frontier dining, though it was consumed more in saloons than at family tables. Whiskey, strong and often harsh, was the most common. Homemade brews and ciders appeared in some households, though brewing required both ingredients and time. For most settlers, alcohol was an occasional indulgence rather than a daily staple. Imagine sitting down for a typical meal in a frontier cabin. A wooden table holds a pot of beans still steaming from hours of cooking. A plate of cornbread rests nearby, its crust browned and crisp from the Dutch oven. Coffee, dark and bitter, fills tin mugs. The air smells of smoke and spice, with perhaps a hint of salted pork added to the pot. It is not a feast by modern standards, but it fills the stomach and warms the body after a long day's work. Special occasions brought more elaborate meals. Holidays or community gatherings might feature roasted meats, pies, and fresh bread baked in larger quantities. Neighbors shared what they could, turning scarce supplies into a collective celebration. These meals were less about abundance and more about fellowship, the joy of coming together and finding comfort in shared foods. Dining on the frontier carried its risks as well. Without refrigeration or consistent food safety practices, spoilage was common. Illness from tainted food or contaminated water was a real danger. Dysentery and food poisoning could spread quickly, especially in crowded towns or during travel. Settlers learned caution, though sometimes hunger left little choice but to eat what was available. Despite the hardships, food remained a source of comfort and identity. Recipes carried from the East or brought by immigrants blended with local ingredients, creating new traditions. German settlers baked hearty breads, Mexican families introduced tortillas and chilies, and Chinese immigrants brought flavors and cooking methods that slowly entered frontier cuisine. Each meal, however simple, carried echoes of home and heritage. Looking back, it is easy to see frontier dining as plain, even harsh. Yet within its limitations, food carried meaning far beyond nutrition. It was a way to gather, to endure, and to connect. A pot of beans simmering on the fire was more than sustenance. It was a reminder of stability in an uncertain world. A shared loaf of bread became a gesture of community, a symbol that even in the wilderness, people could still find warmth and comfort around a table. In the Wild West, food told the story of survival. It reflected scarcity and creativity, hardship and resilience. And though the meals were humble, they nourished not only the body, but also the spirit, helping settlers face each day with the strength to continue. Though frontier life was defined by hard work and survival, it was never without its moments of leisure. Human beings, even in the harshest of circumstances, find ways to rest, to laugh, and to create beauty. On the American frontier, music, theaters, and simple entertainments gave settlers relief from daily burdens and helped build a sense of community in places where isolation was otherwise overwhelming. Music was one of the most constant companions. Instruments such as fiddles, banjos, and harmonicas were portable and relatively durable, making them ideal for life on the move. A fiddler could live in a gathering with reels and jigs, While the harmonica's soft notes carried easily around a campfire, singing was equally important. Families sang hymns at homes. Cowboys sang to calm cattle on long drives, and settlers sang ballads that told stories of longing, travel, and endurance. The style of music varied, reflecting the diverse origins of those who came west. Folk songs from Europe blended with African American spirituals and work songs, while Mexican rancheras and native melodies added further depths. This mixture created a uniquely Western sound, unpolished but heartfelt. In the evenings, music often filled cabins, camps, and saloons, reminding people that even in hardship, joy could be found in shared rhythms. Dancing accompanied much of this music. Community dances were popular events, sometimes held in barns, schoolhouses, or even out in open fields. A caller guided participants through simple steps, and the music carried the dancers late into the night. These gatherings were more than entertainment. They were opportunities for neighbors to connect, for young people to meet, and for communities to strengthen bonds of friendship. Theatre, though less common, brought a different kind of excitement. Traveling theatre troupes made their way from town to town, setting up makeshift stages in saloons, halls, or even outdoors. Their performances ranged from serious dramas to light-hearted comedies, often adapted to suit whatever resources they had. Props were few, costumes simple, but audiences were eager. After months of routine, the chance to watch actors perform brought a taste of culture and novelty to frontier towns. Not all performances were plays. Lectures, poetry readings, and recitations were also popular forms of entertainment. A single speaker could hold the attention of a crowd, weaving stories, humor, or moral lessons into a performance. In some communities, these gatherings doubled as educational opportunities, introducing ideas and literature that might otherwise remain distant in such isolated regions. Saloons, already central to social life, often hosted entertainment. Piano music drifted from their open doors, providing background to conversation and drink. In larger towns, saloons sometimes hired singers or small musical groups. Vaudeville-style shows, featuring music, comedy, and brief theatrical acts, appeared where audiences were large enough to support them. These shows were rarely polished, but they were memorable, blending humor and novelty with the everyday atmosphere of the saloon. Leisure extended beyond music and theater. Storytelling remained one of the oldest and most beloved forms of entertainment. Around campfires or in lamplit cabins, stories passed from one person to another. Tales of past adventures, ghost stories, family histories, or imaginative inventions meant to amuse children. These moments of shared imagination bound families together and gave communities a sense of shared heritage. Games and sports also had their place. Simple card games like poker or faro were staples in saloons, sometimes played casually, sometimes with high stakes. Dice games, checkers, and chess provided quieter forms of competition. Outdoors, horse races, shooting contests, and rodeo-like events offered more physical entertainment, often drawing crowds from miles away. These competitions were not only diversions but opportunities to display skill, strength, and pride. Books and newspapers, when available, offered quieter forms of leisure. A single newspaper might circulate through dozens of hands, its stories and advertisements read aloud for those who could not read themselves. Books, carried carefully in trunks or obtained from traveling peddlers, were treasured possessions. Families often owned only a few volumes, perhaps a Bible, a book of poetry, or a popular novel. Yet these could be read and reread for years, bringing comfort and familiarity. Imagine yourself in a small frontier town on a summer evening. Lanterns flicker along the main street as neighbors gather in the schoolhouse. A traveling troupe has arrived, and excitement hums in the air. Inside, the benches are crowded, the air warms, and the makeshift curtain trembles slightly. When the performance begins, laughter and applause fill the room. For a few hours, the weight of daily labor lifts, replaced by the shared delight of storytelling and performance. Leisure also found expression in seasonal celebrations. Harvest festivals, Independence Day gatherings, and Christmas festivities provided breaks from routine. These occasions included music, games, food, and sometimes fireworks or parades. They were moments of abundance and gratitude, chances to step outside the demands of survival and enjoy the richness of community life. Even solitary leisure mattered. A cowboy resting after a long day might play a tune on his harmonica beneath the stars. A settler might spend an hour writing letters by lamplight, shaping thoughts into words that connected distant families. A child might carve a toy from scrap wood or chase a ball in the dust. These small, private moments carried as much meaning as grand celebrations, offering comfort and continuity in uncertain times. Looking back, leisure in the Wild West was shaped by scarcity and creativity. There were no grand theaters or lavish concert halls, but there was music played on worn fiddles, stories told with laughter, and dances held in barns. What mattered was not refinement but connection. Entertainment was less about spectacle and more about togetherness. A reminder that life was more than work alone. The West was a place of hardship, but it was also a place where people found ways to sing, dance, and dream. Through music, theatre, and simple pleasures, they carved moments of joy into lives otherwise filled with struggle. These moments, fleeting yet powerful, helped shape the enduring spirit of the frontier, one where resilience and creativity met in the quiet, human need for beauty and rest. On the frontier, the pursuit of knowledge often stood in contrast to the roughness of daily survival. Yet even in the most remote settlements, families sought ways to provide education for their children. To teach reading, writing, and arithmetic was not only a matter of practicality but also of hope, a belief that the next generation might live more comfortably, with greater opportunities than their parents had known. The earliest schools were often makeshift. In small communities, classes might be held in a single room of a cabin, a church, or even outdoors beneath the shade of a tree. Desks were fashioned from rough-hewn wood, blackboards from painted planks, and slates from whatever stone could be obtained. Resources were scarce, but the determination to create learning spaces was strong. Schoolhouses became common as communities grew. The image of the one-room schoolhouse, simple squares, with a bell atop the roof, is one of the most enduring symbols of frontier education. Inside, children of all ages sat together, learning side by side. The teacher stood at the front, guiding lessons for beginners and advanced students alike. Order was not always perfect, but the structure gave a sense of progress and discipline. Teachers were central to this system, though their circumstances were often difficult. Many were young women, sometimes barely older than their students, who took up teaching as one of the few professions available to them. Others were men seeking temporary work while saving money for land or other ventures. Their pay was modest, often supplemented with room and board provided by local families. Despite the challenges, teachers were respected, as their role was seen as vital to the future of the community. The curriculum focused on the basics. Reading and writing formed the foundations, taught through primers such as the famous McGuffey readers. Arithmetic followed, teaching students how to calculate sums, measure, and manage trade. Geography and history were added when time and materials allowed, though lessons often carried a strong moral tone. Education was not only about knowledge but also about shaping character, with emphasis on honesty, hard work, and patriotism. Discipline in schools could be strict. With large groups of children in close quarters, order was difficult to maintain. Teachers used firm rules, and punishments for misbehavior included standing in corners, writing lines, or, in some cases, corporal disciplines. While harsh by modern standards, such methods reflected the values of the times, where obedience and diligence were seen as essential qualities for survival and success. Attendance was irregular, shaped by the demands of farm and ranch life. During planting and harvest seasons, many children stayed home to work alongside their families, Winter months often saw better attendance as farm duties eased and the need for indoor activity increased. For many children, schooling was scattered and brief, yet even limited instruction provided a foundation for literacy and numeracy that could transform lives. Books and supplies were precious. A single reader might be shared among several students, and slates were used repeatedly, wiped clean at the end of each lesson. Pencils, ink, and paper were expensive, so writing was practiced sparingly. The scarcity of materials encouraged creativity and resourcefulness, and students learned to value what little they had. Beyond the schoolhouse, education also took place at home. Parents taught practical skills: farming, sewing, cooking, and animal care. Stories, proverbs, and family traditions passed along knowledge that no classroom could replace. For many, this blend of formal and informal education prepared children not only for daily work, but also for the responsibilities of adulthood. Imagine stepping into a frontier schoolhouse on a cold winter morning. The air is sharp outside, but inside, the poppy stove gives off steady warmth. Children sit at wooden benches, bundled in simple clothing, their slates and chalk ready. The teacher writes on a blackboard, her handwriting firm and deliberate. Outside, snow falls quietly, but inside the room is filled with the soft sounds of recitation, voices repeating arithmetic tables, spelling words, and moral lessons. As towns grew larger and more prosperous, education expanded. High schools and academies began to appear, though they remained rare in the early years. For most children, education ended after a few years of basic schooling, replaced by the demands of work. Yet those who continued often went on to become teachers, clerks, or leaders in their communities, carrying the value of education into the broader fabric of frontier life. Churches often played a role in promoting education. Sunday schools taught not only religious instruction but also reading and writing. Missionary groups established schools for immigrant and indigenous children, though these were sometimes shaped by cultural biases and assimilationist goals. Still, they reflected the deep belief that education was a path toward improvement, even if its methods and intentions were not always just. For settlers, education symbolized stability. A schoolhouse was a mark of permanence, evidence that a town had grown beyond mere survival to envision a future. To build a school was to declare hope, that children deserved the chance to learn, that communities could nurture more than just crops and livestock, and that knowledge had a place even in the wilderness. Looking back, frontier education may appear modest, even limited by modern standards. Yet within its wooden walls, something vital occurred. Children learned to read words that opened doors to distant places. They learned to write letters that connected families across miles. They learned arithmetic that allowed them to trade, to build, and to plan. Above all, they learned that knowledge mattered, and that even in the most rugged of environments, learning could flourish. In the end, schools of the West were not simply about textbooks and lessons. They were about resilience, about the belief that hardship need not prevent growth. In cabins and one-room schoolhouses, among slates and blackboards, children carried forward the dreams of their families. Their education, however humble, planted seeds that shaped the generations to come. For many settlers in the American West, faith was both a source of comfort and a framework for community. In a world marked by hardships, uncertainty, and isolation, religion offered stability. Churches, whether grand or humble, were more than places of worship. They were gathering spaces, moral centers, and symbols of permanence in an otherwise unsettled land. At first, formal churches were rare. In the earliest days of settlement, when communities were still scattered, religious gatherings often took place in homes, barns, or outdoors. A traveling preacher might visit once every few weeks or months, holding services wherever space could be found. These meetings were simple, with prayers, hymns, and sermons delivered to groups eager for both spiritual and social connection. As towns grew, the construction of a church was often one of the first communal projects. Even if built from rough logs or plain boards, a church represented more than its materials. It signaled that the community had taken roots, that there was a shared commitment to values beyond mere survival. The sound of a bell calling worshippers to gather was a reassuring rhythm in a life otherwise governed by the unpredictability of weather, crops, and chance. Religion in the West was diverse, reflecting the varied backgrounds of settlers. Protestant denominations such as Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians were widespread, often relying on circuit riders, preachers who traveled long routes to serve multiple towns. Catholic churches grew especially in areas influenced by Spanish and Mexican heritage, while Jewish and Orthodox Christian communities also established themselves where immigrant populations settled. Each tradition brought its own forms of worship, but all provided a sense of belonging and continuity. Worship services were typically modest. Wooden pews, a plain pulpit, and simple hymnals were common furnishings. Music came from the voices of the congregations. Sometimes accompanied by a pump organ or fiddle, sermons emphasized morality, perseverance, and faith, offering guidance for lives filled with uncertainty. For many, Sunday services were the highlight of the week. A pause from labor, a chance to dress in clean clothes, and an opportunity to see neighbors. Beyond worship, churches often served as centers of community life. They hosted meetings, social gatherings, and celebrations. Weddings and funerals, milestones of joy and sorrow, were most often held under their roofs. Churchyards became resting places for the departed, linking the living with their ancestors and reminding settlers of continuity, even in a changing land. Revival meetings were another feature of frontier religion. These gatherings, often held outdoors beneath tents or in open fields, drew large crowds from miles around. Preachers spoke with passion, urging repentance and renewals. The energy of these meetings, filled with singing, prayers, and emotional responses, was a striking contrast to the often quiet rhythm of daily frontier life. For many, revivals were both spiritual experiences and social events, moments when isolation gave way to shared fervor. Religion also shaped education and charity. Many schools were established by churches, with ministers or nuns serving as teachers. Lessons often blended academic instruction with moral and religious teaching, emphasizing honesty, discipline, and devotions. Churches organized aid for those in need, whether providing food to struggling families, helping widows and orphans, or offering shelter to travelers. In places where government services were minimal, the church's role in social support was vital. Imagine a small frontier town on a Sunday morning. The air is still, the streets unusually quiet, as families make their way to a modest wooden church. Inside, sunlight filters through plain glass windows, casting soft patterns on the pews. The congregation sings a hymn, voices blending in imperfect harmony, but with great feeling. The preacher speaks from the pulpit, his words steady and clear, reminding all of endurance, faith, and hope. For a brief hour, the hardships outside fade, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. Not all interactions with religion were harmonious. Differences between denominations sometimes created tensions, and the efforts of missionaries toward indigenous communities often reflected cultural imposition as much as spiritual guidance. For native peoples, traditional beliefs clashed with the pressures of assimilation, creating complex legacies that are still felt today. Religion, while a force of comfort for many settlers, was also tied to the broader currents of change and conflict in the West. Despite these complexities, the presence of churches grew steadily as towns prospered. Modest wooden structures were sometimes replaced with larger buildings, complete with steeples and stained glass. Bells rang out across dusty streets, marking weddings, funerals, and Sunday services. The church became a visible sign of community maturity, a landmark as enduring as the schoolhouse or courthouse. Faith on the frontier was often practical as well as spiritual. People prayed for rain in times of drought, for healing in times of illness, and for safety when loved ones traveled. Religion was not an abstract philosophy, but a daily companion, woven into the routines of work and rest. Grace was said before meals, prayers whispered before bed, hymns sung while working. In this way, religion permeated frontier life quietly, steadily, always present. Looking back, religion in the Wild West was not simply about doctrine or ritual. It was about the human need for meaning and connections. Churches provided reassurance when life was uncertain, fellowship when isolation weighed heavily, and guidance when choices were difficult. They were places where individuals became communities, where hope was nurtured even in the face of hardship. In the end, the story of religion in the West is one of persistence. Amid dust, distance, and danger, settlers carried their faith with them, shaping it to fit new landscapes and new realities. Churches rose from the plains and mountains, built with hands calloused from labor but guided by devotion. Through hymns, prayers, and gatherings, they offered not only worship but also the enduring comfort of shared belief. When imagining life in the Wild West, it is easy to picture the wide landscapes, the small towns, and the daily labor that shaped existence. Yet another, quieter reality was always present: the struggle to maintain health in an era when medicine was as uncertain as the frontier itself. Illness and injury were constant companions, and healing practices reflected both resourcefulness and the limits of 19th century knowledge. Doctors in the frontier towns often carried impressive titles but modest training. Some had studied in medical schools, though standards varied widely. Others learned through apprenticeships or even declared themselves doctors without formal instructions. Medical science in the 1870s was still developing, with germ theory only beginning to gain recognition. The idea that unseen microbes cause disease had not yet fully shaped practice, so sterilization of instruments and proper hygiene were often neglected. For many settlers, the town doctor was both a figure of trust and a source of uncertainty. His black bag might contain simple remedies, such as laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol used for pain, or quinine for fevers. But it also held substances that today would be considered dangerous: mercury, arsenic, or bloodletting tools. Treatments could ease symptoms or, just as easily, worsen them. Still, in times of crisis, a doctor's presence offered comfort, if not always cure. Surgical procedures were particularly daunting. Without modern anesthesia, patients were often given whiskey or morphine to dull the pain. Operations were performed swiftly, not only to reduce suffering, but also because antiseptic techniques were rudimentary. Amputations, common in cases of severe injury or infections, were performed with speed and determination. Survival depended on the patient's overall health and a measure of luck, as infection could set in at any moment. For those living far from towns, reaching a doctor was not always possible. Families learned to handle many ailments themselves, using knowledge passed down through generations. Home remedies were a blend of folk tradition, herbal medicine, and improvisation. Chamomile tea for fevers, poultices made of bread or herbs for wounds, and honey for sore throats were common practices. Indigenous peoples contributed extensive knowledge of plants and natural healing, sharing remedies for burns, digestive troubles, or snake bites. Such practices were invaluable in remote areas where professional care was days away. Midwives played an especially vital role in frontier medicine. Childbirth was a moment of both hope and danger, and the presence of an experienced midwife often meant the difference between life and death. Women supported one another during labor, and skills were passed through communities, yet mortality remained high. In some places, as many as 1 in 4 women might not survive childbirth, while infants faced equally precarious odds. Even so, the resilience of frontier families meant that life continued, sustained by courage and community support. Imagine, for a moment, waking with a fever in a small cabin far from town. The air feels heavy, your body weaks. A family member brings you water drawn from a nearby creek, boiled if fuel allows, though perhaps not. They prepare a remedy of herbs or broths, hoping to strengthen you, Outside, the work of the homestead continues. Animals must be tended, fields maintained. Yet time seems to pause as all attention focuses on your recovery. The uncertainty is palpable. Will rest and care restore your health, or will illness deepen, becoming another tale of loss in a land already marked by hardships? Disease was one of the greatest threats in the Wild West. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox swept through communities, spreading quickly in places without proper sanitation. Outbreaks could decimate towns within weeks. Quarantine was sometimes attempted, though often too late. Vaccination against smallpox existed but was not always accessible. For many, survival depended more on isolation and luck than on medical intervention. Dentistry, too, was rudimentary. Toothaches were treated by extraction, often without anesthetics. Travelers might carry small tools to pull teeth themselves or rely on a blacksmith or barber who offered dental services as a sideline. The loss of teeth was common, accepted as an inevitable part of life. Few expected to grow old with a full set of teeth, and many did not grow old at all. Despite these difficulties, there were glimmers of progress. As railroads expanded, medical supplies became more available. Newspapers and almanacs carried advice, some practical, some questionable, but always read with interest. Traveling medicine shows visited towns selling bottles of cure-alls that promised relief from every ailment. These potions, often heavy in alcohol or narcotics, provided temporary comfort, if not lasting healing. The shows themselves were events, blending entertainment with commerce, giving communities both distraction and a sense of connection to the wider worlds. Medicine on the frontier was as much about spirit as science. Healing often relied on hope, on the will to endure, and on the care of neighbors. Communities came together when illness struck, bringing food, tending children, or keeping watch through long nights. Even when cures failed, the presence of others provided strength. The story of medicine in the Wild West is one of contrasts, of progress and limitations, of suffering and resilience. Settlers carried both fear and faith into every illness, knowing that health was fragile, yet life demanded perseverance. Looking back, we see not just the hardships, but also the extraordinary determination of those who faced them. They survived not because medicine was certain, but because community, courage, and sheer endurance carried them through. Life in the Wild West was shaped not only by the roughness of frontier towns or the uncertainty of travel, but also by the steady rhythm of the land itself. For many settlers, survival depended on farming or ranching, the quiet but relentless work of raising food and livestock in landscapes that were as beautiful as they were unforgiving. At first glance, farming on the frontier might sound simple: plant seeds, harvest crops, feed a family. But in reality, it was a daily struggle with soil, weather, and limited tools. Many settlers who journeyed west had little experience with agriculture. They learned through trial and error, testing the land with corn, wheat, beans, or potatoes, and hoping each season would provide enough for both food and trade. The soil varied greatly. In some areas, rich earth allowed for fertile harvests. In others, especially where prairie grasses had grown for centuries, plowing was nearly impossible. Wooden plows broke easily, and iron plows were precious. The work of turning the ground was slow, often done with teams of oxen or horses straining against stubborn roots. Dust clung to clothes and skins, and each furrow carved into the earth was a small victory. Water, too, was uncertain. Rainfall was unpredictable, and droughts could turn hopeful fields into cracked stretches of dust. Settlers dug wells, built cisterns, and carried water from streams, each drop guarded carefully. Irrigation ditches, where possible, transformed dry land into fertile ground, but maintaining them was laborious. Storms, on the other hand, could destroy in a single hour what had taken months to cultivate, flattening crops with hail or flooding fields, until nothing remained but muds. The daily routine of a frontier farm was demanding. Sunrise marked the beginning of work, with animals to feed, fields to tend, fences to mend, and tools to repair. Children joined in from an early age, carrying water, gathering eggs, or helping in the fields. Meals were simple: bread, beans, or cornmeal, often supplemented by whatever could be hunted or foraged. Every task carried weights, for neglecting even small duties could mean loss of food or livestock. Ranching, though different in practice, was just as challenging. Vast stretches of open land offered grazing space for cattle, but they also required constant vigilance. Cowboys drove herds across long distances, guiding them to water and fresh pasture. Branding identified ownerships, a necessity in lands where open ranges blurred property lines. Nights were spent beneath the stars, keeping watch to prevent stampedes or thefts. Cattle drives became a defining feature of the ranching life. From Texas northward to railheads in Kansas or Nebraska, herds of thousands were guided along dusty trails. The journey lasted weeks or months, marked by long days in the saddle and nights of weary rests. Weather was an ever-present threat. Storms scattered cattle, while heat and dust wore down both men and animals. Yet these drives were vital, connecting isolated ranches to the growing markets of the East. Imagine standing in the middle of a small farmstead at dusk. A wooden fence surrounds a patch of corn, the stalks swaying in the evening breeze. Chickens settle into their coops, and the low sound of cattle drifts from a nearby field. The sky glows with the fading light, painting the horizon in shades of gold and violets. The air carries the scent of earth, of hay, and of smoke from a cooking fire. In this moment, the challenges of the day soften into a quiet satisfaction. Life is not easy, but it feels grounded, tethered to the steady rhythms of land and sky. The tools of farming and ranching were simple but essential. Plows, wagons, harnesses, and saddles required constant repair. A broken handle or worn strap might mean lost time or failed works. Blacksmiths were highly valued for keeping equipment usable. Families often made do with what they had, repurposing materials or crafting replacements by hand. Creativity and endurance were as vital as strengths. Community played an important role in both farming and ranching. Neighbors helped one another with harvests, barn raisings, and branding seasons. Shared labor lightened the load, and gatherings turned necessity into fellowship. These events brought music, food, and laughter, creating moments of joy amid the demands of daily survival. Stories of cooperation remind us that even in the solitude of wide plains, people sought connection and relied on one another. The unpredictability of the land often reminded settlers of their vulnerabilities. Swarms of locusts could strip entire fields bare in a matter of hours. Harsh winters trapped families in their cabins, livestock struggling to survive. Summers brought relentless heat, testing both people and crops. Yet through each challenge, the determination to endure carried settlers forward. Farming and ranching were not just economic choices, they were acts of persistence, efforts to carve stability from uncertainty. Cattle ranching in particular shaped the image of the West, with cowboys becoming legendary figures in later stories and films. But the reality was quieter, often lonelier. The long hours, the physical strain, and the constant exposure to the elements left little room for glamour. Yet for many, the life offered freedoms, a chance to live in wide open spaces, guided more by the horizon than by clocks or cities. Looking back, we see that farming and ranching were the backbone of frontier survival. They required steady labor, resilience, and cooperation. They tied people to the land, for better or worse, and shaped communities across the plains and deserts. Though hardships were many, each harvest, each calf born, each meal placed on the table was a reminder of perseverance. In the quiet of those days, with fields stretching wide and herds moving slowly across the horizon, the essence of the frontier was clear. It was not only a place of danger or adventure, but also of steady effort, where ordinary families and workers built lives from the soil and grass beneath their feet. Their story is one of endurance, a testament to the strength required simply to live, season by season, on the vast frontier. Among the many journeys that shaped the American West, few were as iconic or as grueling as the Oregon Trails, stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri to the fertile valleys of Oregon. The trail was not a single road, but a network of rutted paths, river crossings, and mountain passes. To walk or ride its length was to commit months of life to an uncertain road, guided by hope, endurance, and the promise of a new beginnings. For families who set out, preparation began long before the first wagon wheel turned westward. Supplies were gathered with care: flour, beans, bacon, dried fruit, coffee, and salt, all packed tightly into wooden barrels and sacks. Tools, spare parts for wagons, and weapons were included, as were cherished items from home, a family Bible, a quilt, or a few books. Space was limited, and choices were difficult. Often, sentimental objects had to be left behind, traded for the necessities of survival. The wagon itself was the heart of the journey. Contrary to the image of covered wagons as comfortable traveling homes, most families walked beside them rather than rode within. The jolting of wheels over rough terrain made riding unpleasant, and every step spared the draft animals from extra weights. Oxen were favored over horses or mules, steady though slow, valued for their endurance rather than speed. Each day began at dawn. Fires were lit, breakfast prepared, and camp broken down. Wagons moved in long lines, dust rising behind them in shimmering clouds. Children walked beside parents, carrying sticks, chasing after one another, or helping guide animals. The pace was steady but never hurried. 10 to 15 miles in a day was considered good progress. The landscape shifted gradually, from river valleys to plains, then to mountains, each stretch presenting its own trials. Water was always a concern. Streams and rivers provided life, but crossings were perilous. Wagons could tip, animals could falter, and belongings might be lost to the current. Families sometimes joined together, forming circles of wagons at night for protection and mutual support. In the evenings, the glow of campfires dotted the land with songs, prayers, and quiet conversation carrying through the air. Illness was perhaps the greatest danger. Diseases such as cholera spread swiftly among travelers, especially when water was contaminated. Fevers, dysenteries, and injuries from accidents claimed more lives than attacks or storms. Graves lined the trails, often marked with simple wooden crosses or carved stones. Yet despite the losses, the wagons continued forward, driven by necessity and hopes. Imagine yourself walking along a dusty stretch of trail. The sun is high, the horizon endless, and the steady creak of wagon wheels fills your ears. Your shoes wear thin, dust clings to your skin, and the air smells of earth and sweat. As ahead, mountains rise faintly in the distance, promising both challenge and reward. Around you, families press on quietly, each step a reminder of determination. In this vastness, every mile feels both difficult and significant. Encounters along the trail were varied. Trading posts offered supplies at high prices, while military forts provided shelter and news. Travelers met indigenous peoples, sometimes peacefully through trade and guidance, sometimes tensely as the pressure of migration disrupted traditional lands. Misunderstandings and conflict were part of the journey, but so too were acts of generosity and exchange. The trail demanded constant decision-making: which route to take across a river, which mountain pass to attempt, when to rest, and when to push onward. Leadership often fell to experienced guides, but in many cases families made choices together, balancing the need for progress with the limits of their strength. As the months passed, seasons shifted. Spring rains turned paths to mud, while summer heat baked the earth. By autumn, snow threatened in the mountains, urging travelers to hurry before passes became impassable. The rhythm of nature dictated the pace, and delays could prove costly. A broken wagon wheel or the loss of an ox could alter the course of an entire journey. Despite hardships, there were moments of beauty. Sunsets stretched across the plains in brilliant colors. Rivers sparkled in the morning light. The wide silence of the prairie gave way to the towering majesty of mountains. For children especially, the journey was filled with discovery, new plants, animals, and endless horizons that shaped their memories for a lifetime. The trail ended not with a sudden arrival, but with a gradual change. Fertile valleys appeared, rivers widened, and the land grew greener. Families who had endured the long road found themselves at last in Oregon, greeted by opportunities to settle, farm, and begin anew. The relief was immense, though the memory of the journey never faded. Looking back, the Oregon Trail was more than a path across lands. It was a test of endurance, a shared undertaking that shaped families and communities. Those who survived carried with them stories of hardship and resilience, reminders of the determination required to cross thousands of miles in search of a different life. The Oregon Trail remains one of the defining images of the American West, its ruts still visible in some places today. Speak of countless footsteps and wagon wheels that pressed into the earth. They remind us of the courage it took to walk into the unknown, guided by little more than hope, faith, and the steady rhythm of progress, mile by mile. The American West was not only a land of open plains and distant mountains, but also a place alive with creatures. For settlers and travelers, encounters with wildlife were part of daily life, sometimes a source of wonder, sometimes of danger, and always a reminder that the frontier belonged first to nature. The vast prairies, stretching beyond sights, were home to herds of bison that once moved like dark rivers across the land. Early travelers marveled at the sights, thousands of animals grazing, their movements shaking the ground. For native peoples, the bison was central to life, providing food, clothing, tools, and spiritual meaning. For settlers, however, the bison was often seen as both a marvel and a challenge, its presence shaping the rhythm of the land they entered. Deer, elk, antelope were also common, offering meat for families who knew how to hunt. Smaller animals such as rabbits, squirrels, and prairie chickens provided food when larger game was scarce. Hunting was not only practical but often necessary, especially when crops failed or supplies dwindled. Yet it carried its risks wandering too far from camp, encountering predators, or expending precious ammunition. Predators were an ever-present reality. Wolves followed herds and sometimes lingered near settlements, their howls echoing through the night. For families unaccustomed to such sounds, the chorus could be unsettling, a reminder of wilderness just beyond the firelight. Coyotes, sly and adaptable, prowled the edges of farms, searching for chickens or scraps. Bears roamed forests and mountains, occasionally appearing where food was stored carelessly. Though attacks were rare, the possibility kept settlers cautious, especially in unfamiliar terrain. Snakes were another challenge. Rattlesnakes, hidden among rocks or grass, startled travelers and posed serious danger with their venomous bite. Families learned to walk carefully, to listen for the warning rattle, and to keep boots high and firm. Antidotes were crude or non-existent, so prevention was the only reliable defense. Not all encounters with wildlife were threatening. Birds filled the skies, their songs marking mornings and evenings. Hawks circled overhead, and flocks of geese migrated in shifting patterns. In the spring, meadows bloomed with wildflowers, alive with bees and butterflies. To those who paused to notice, these scenes offered beauty and reassurance amid hardship. Imagine a quiet evening on the prairie. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the grass. In the distance, antelope graze, their movements quick and light. A hawk drifts on the wind, scanning the ground below. Nearby, a rabbit darts into its burrow, leaving only a ripple in the tall grass. Around the campfires, you feel the presence of the wilderness pressing close, vast and alive, yet balanced in its own rhythms. Livestock brought by settlers often drew the attention of wild creatures. Chickens attracted foxes, cattle tempted wolves or mountain lions. Families built sturdy pens, set traps, or kept dogs as guardians. Every night carried the possibility of a raid, and vigilance became part of the routine of frontier life. Some encounters were surprising. Travelers told of waking to find bison grazing near their tents or hearing the footsteps of elk in the dark. In forests, raccoons might rummage through supplies, their clever paws leaving a mess of scattered food. Skunks, too, wandered freely, teaching quick lessons about caution and respect. These small but memorable incidents became part of the stories families carried with them, retold long after the danger had passed. Fishing offered both sustenance and quiet relief. Rivers and streams were filled with trout, catfish, and perch. A line dropped in the water after a day of travel or work could bring not only food, but also a moment of stillness. Sitting by the water, listening to its steady flow, reminded settlers of the balance between effort and rest, between survival and the beauty of the natural world. The presence of wildlife also carried symbolic weight. To many, the animals represented freedom, resilience, or mystery. For indigenous peoples, animals often held deep spiritual meanings, woven into traditions, stories, and ceremonies. Settlers, while sometimes fearful, also found inspiration in the creatures around them. The sight of an eagle soaring high above, or the resilience of a prairie dog colony, spoke to qualities they themselves needed: strength, adaptability, and endurance. But as settlement expanded, wildlife was pushed back. Herds of bison dwindled under relentless huntings. Forests grew quieter as animals fled. The balance that had existed for centuries shifted quickly, replaced by fences, farms, and towns. For those who witnessed both abundance and decline, the memory of the West's teeming wildlife lingered as both a marvel and a loss. In the daily lives of frontier families, wildlife was a constant companion, sometimes threatening, sometimes helpful, always present. It was the rustle in the grass, the shadow on the horizon, the call in the night. To live in the West was to live alongside creatures, to respect their presence and to adapt to their ways. Looking back, encounters with wildlife remind us of the frontier as more than a human story. It was a meeting place of people and animals, of survival and coexistence. Each held each flight of birds, each paw print in the dust carried its own story. Together, they formed a living backdrop to the journey of those who settled the American West, shaping both memory and meaning in a land alive with wildness. Long before settlers built cabins, planted fields, or raised towns, the lands of the American West were home to indigenous peoples. Their presence stretched back for centuries, marked by deep knowledge of the land, complex traditions, and strong community ties. To speak of the frontier is to acknowledge not just the arrival of settlers, but also the lives already rooted in its rivers, plains, forests, and mountains. The West was never empty. Tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and many others lived across vast territories, each with unique languages, customs, and ways of life. Some were hunters, following the movements of bison or deer. Others farmed, cultivating corn, beans, and squash in fertile valleys. Still others traded, weaving networks of exchange that stretched far across regions. Each people held a relationship with the land that was practical, spiritual, and enduring. For settlers moving west, encounters with indigenous peoples varied. At times they were moments of trade and cooperation. Food, furs, horses, and knowledge of the land could be exchanged, and for wary travelers, such exchanges often meant survival. Indigenous guides led parties safely across unfamiliar territory, pointing out water sources or safer paths. Stories of generosity and shared meals reveal the possibility of mutual respect. Yet tensions also grew quickly. The expansion of trails and towns disrupted traditional hunting grounds, farming areas, and sacred spaces. The sheer number of settlers placed pressure on land and resources. For many indigenous communities, this intrusion was not only physical but cultural, threatening traditions, languages, and ways of life. Misunderstandings, fueled by fear or prejudice, often deepened into conflict. Imagine walking with a small group of settlers as they cross the plains. In the distance, you see riders approaching, moving swiftly across the grass. They are dressed differently, their presence commanding. For a moment, silence hangs between the groups, broken only by the wind. Then words are exchanged, cautious, careful, yet carrying the possibility of trust. Such meetings, uncertain yet significant, were part of the daily reality of the frontiers. Indigenous peoples carried immense knowledge of the natural world. They understood which plants could heal, which waters were safe, which trails avoided storms. Their skills in tracking hunting and navigating the land were unmatched. To settlers unfamiliar with the vastness of the West, this wisdom could mean the difference between survival and loss. Yet too often, this knowledge was undervalued or dismissed, even as it quietly shaped the journeys of many. Spiritual traditions also shaped indigenous lives. Ceremonies, dances, and stories connected communities to ancestors and to the land itself. The rhythms of nature, the seasons, the migrations of animals, the rising and setting of the sun, were woven into meaning and memory. For those who lived this way, the land was not only a place to survive, but a living presence worthy of respect and care. As settlement advanced, conflict became more frequent. Treaties were signed, often under pressure, promising land or peace, but seldom honored. Military forts appeared across the West, symbols of authority but also reminders of broken agreements. Battles and forced relocations scarred the lives of many indigenous peoples, reshaping entire regions. Behind each event were families, communities and traditions struggling to endure. Still, resilience remained. Many indigenous groups adapted, combining old practices with new circumstances. Horses, introduced earlier by the Spanish, had already transformed life on the plains, making hunting and travel swifter. Communities adjusted, preserving stories, songs, and ceremonies even under strain. The survival of languages, traditions, and identity across centuries is a testament to strength that endured despite enormous challenges. For settlers, encounters with indigenous peoples often carried fear shaped by rumor and misunderstanding. Stories of raids or battles traveled quickly, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes true. But quieter stories, of shared food, of advice given by a guide, of friendship across cultures, were just as real, though less often told. These moments remind us that the frontier was not only a place of conflict, but also of human connection. Picture a summer evening on the plains. A circle of lodges stands near a river, smoke rising from fires where meals are prepared. Children laugh and run, while elders speak quietly, watching the horizon. Horses graze nearby, their silhouettes outlined by fading light. This scene, ordinary and yet profound, reflects the daily life of countless indigenous communities, lived fully long before and during the arrival of settlers. The history of the West cannot be told without recognizing loss, of land, of lives, of ways disrupted. But it also cannot be told without honoring continuity. Despite hardship, indigenous peoples remain, carrying forward traditions, languages, and resilience. Their story is not one of disappearance but of endurance, of voices that continue to speak through time. Looking back, we see the frontier not as empty land awaiting settlement, but as a meeting place of cultures. Indigenous peoples were not background figures but central to the story, shaping and reshaping the land alongside all who entered it. To remember this is to bring balance to our understanding of the past, to see the West not only through the eyes of those who arrived, but also through those who had always been there. When most people imagine the Wild West, they often picture a narrow cast of characters, white cowboys, grizzled sheriffs, and saloon brawlers. But the real frontier was far more diverse than these simple images suggest. The American West was not the story of one group alone. It was a meeting place where cultures, languages, and traditions mingled, sometimes uneasily, but always shaping the land together. By the mid to late 1800s, the frontier had drawn people from across the world. Immigrants arrived from Europe, Asia, and Latin America, each carrying their own skills, hopes, and struggles. African Americans, both freed and formerly enslaved, found opportunities in ranching, farming, and settlement. Indigenous peoples continued to live across their ancestral lands, adapting even as pressure mounted around them. The West, in truth, was a tapestry woven from many threads. Take, for instance, the story of the cowboys. popular culture paints them as rugged white men driving cattle under wide skies. Yet historians now estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys were African American. Many had come west after emancipation, seeking freedom from the harsh restrictions of the South. Others were born into the frontier lifestyles, skilled riders and herders who made their living moving cattle across vast distances. Their songs, techniques, and traditions shaped cowboy culture itself, though their contributions were rarely celebrated in later retellings. Alongside them were Mexican vaqueros, whose horsemanship and cattle handling practices had been refined long before the rise of the American cowboy. Words like rodeo, lariat, and chaps come directly from Spanish, reminders of how deeply Mexican traditions influenced ranching life in the borderlands of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Mexican families formed communities that blended old customs with new realities. Despite prejudice and the loss of land following war and annexation, their cultural presence endured, visible in language, food, music, and works. Across the plains and mountains, European immigrants also carved out places for themselves. Germans, Scandinavians, Irish, Italians, and others arrived with hopes of farming or mining. Each group brought its own traditions. Methods of building homes, recipes for bread and cheese, festivals carried from distant homelands. Many settled together, creating clusters where their languages were spoken and churches reflected their heritage. On a quiet evening, one might hear hymns sung in German drifting across prairie fields, or the sound of a Scandinavian fiddle echoing in a wooden hall. Chinese immigrants played an essential role, especially in building the transcontinental railroad. Thousands labored in dangerous conditions, blasting tunnels through mountains and laying track across deserts. Their endurance was extraordinary, though their pay was often less than that of white workers, and their lives carried constant risk from both accidents and discriminations. Beyond the railroads, Chinese communities established laundries, restaurants, and small shops in frontier towns, offering services settlers relied upon daily. Despite facing harsh laws that limited their rights, they preserved traditions of food, language, and community, leaving a lasting mark on the cultural landscape of the West. The diversity of the frontier could be seen even in small towns. Imagine walking down a dusty main street in the 1870s. On one side stands a German bakery with the smell of fresh bread drifting out. Next door, a Mexican-owned cantina serves beans and tortillas alongside strong coffee. Across the way, a Chinese laundry displays clean shirts drying in the sun. A blacksmith, perhaps Irish-born, hammers iron into shape, while outside, African-American cowans tether their horses after days on the trail. The sounds of different languages overlap, and the smells of varied cuisines mingle. It is not a simple picture, but a rich one. Of course, diversity did not mean equality. Prejudice ran deep, and many groups faced exclusion or violence. Chinese workers were targeted by discriminatory laws and mob attacks. African Americans found opportunities limited, even in freedom. Mexican landowners lost property through legal manipulation or outright thefts. Indigenous peoples faced the gravest injustices of all, forced from their lands by settlement and policy. Diversity was real, but it coexisted with division and hardship. Yet, within this complexity, there were also moments of exchange and cooperation. Techniques of farming were shared across cultures. Foods blended together. Chili peppers from Mexico, wheat from Europe, coffee from distant lands, creating new flavors on frontier tables. Music, too, traveled across borders. A fiddle tune might carry echoes of Ireland, while rhythms learned from African traditions found their way into cowboy songs. Even in hardships, cultures touched and shaped one another. Picture a frontier festival, perhaps a town's small attempt at celebration after harvests. Families gather in a clearing, lanterns swaying in the breeze. Children play while adults share food, German sausages, Mexican tamales, simple stews cooked over open fires. Someone plays a banjo, another a fiddle, and soon the music mingles into something new. Laughter rises. Stories are told, and for an evening, the divisions of daily life soften into shared humanity. This was the quieter truth of the West, not only conflict but coexistence, not only hardship but resilience. In the long nights, in the shared work of survival, people learned from one another, even as they struggled with differences. When we look back today, it is important to remember that the Wild West was not a single story but many. It was a place where black cowboys rode beside white ranchers, where Mexican vaqueros taught their skills to newcomers, where Chinese laborers carved railroads through stones, where European farmers turned prairie into fields, and where indigenous peoples held fast to traditions against great odds. The myth of the frontier often narrows the past, but the reality was broad, complex, and deeply human. The diversity of the Wild West was not simply a backdrop. It was the very fabric of the place, shaping how people lived, worked, and imagined their futures. As evening falls on our chapter, picture again that main street, now quiet in the soft glow of oil lamps. Behind wooden walls, families from many corners of the world prepare for rest. Some speak in German, others in Spanish, others in English or Chinese. The murmur of voices blends into a single, steady hum of life. And outside, under the vast western skies, the stars shine down equally on all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Wild West shifted into a quieter rhythm. The heat of the day faded, replaced by a cool breeze that slipped across open plains, rustled through cottonwood trees, and whispered against the walls of log cabins. In the growing dusk, shadows stretched long, and the world took on a softer, slower tone. For those who lived on the frontiers, nightfall was not just the close of a day. It was a transition into a world shaped by lamplight, starlight, and the steady silence of wide open spaces. Life on the frontier followed the rhythms of nature. Without electric light, people rose and rested by the cycle of the sun. Darkness arrived swiftly once twilight passed, and lanterns, candles, or the glow of a hearth were the only sources of illumination. A single flame could fill a room with a golden warmth, its flicker casting gentle patterns against wooden walls. For settlers accustomed to hard labor, this dim glow marked a time of rest, when the tools of the day were set aside and families gathered close. Inside cabins, the evenings often carried a sense of intimacy. The fires, once used for cooking, now gave comfort against the chill. Children might sit near their parents, listening to stories told in hushed voices, tales of home, of faraway lands, or of the journey westward. Songs might be sung softly, accompanied by a fiddle or harmonica. The roughness of the day eased into quiet companionship, the hardships of survival momentarily softened by togetherness. In small towns, nights could be livelier. Saloons glowed with lamplights, their doors swinging open as men entered after long hours of work. The sound of piano music drifted into the street, mingling with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses. Yet even in these bustling spaces the light never reached far. Step outside, and the music would fade into the vastness of the night, leaving only the sounds of crickets and the far-off call of an owl. For those living on isolated farms or ranches, nights could feel different, quieter, yet filled with their own kind of presence. Beyond the walls of the home, darkness stretched endlessly. The prairie seemed both calm and alive. Coyotes howled, insects hummed, and horses shifted restlessly in corrals. The stars, unbroken by city lights, spilled across the sky in a dazzling display. Settlers often remarked on this sight, the Milky Way stretching overhead like a silver river, constellations sharp and clear, and the moon casting a soft glow over the land. In the silence, one could feel both small and deeply connected to the immensity of nature. For many nights also carried a practical side. Chores did not always end with sunset. Animals might need tending, fires stoked, or water brought in from a well. Some households took turns keeping watch, especially in unsettled regions where wildlife or human danger could threaten. Even so, the late hours were usually reserved for much-needed rest, the body recovering from long days of work beneath the sun. Sleep itself was shaped by the rhythms of the frontier. Beds were simple: wooden frames, straw mattresses, rough quilts, and blankets made by hand. Families sometimes slept in the same room, the warmth of shared space warding off colds. The sounds of the night, the creak of timbers, the crackle of firewood, the sigh of wind against the roof, became a lullaby of sorts. Though comfort was sparse, rest came with the knowledge that another demanding day would soon begin. Night on the frontier also carried a spiritual quality. With so few distractions, many found time to reflect, to pray, or simply to sit in silence. Some wrote in diaries by candlelight, recording the small victories and struggles of daily life. Others read from treasured books, their pages worn from repeated handling. In the quiet, thoughts turned inwards, shaped by both solitude and the immensity of the world outside the cabin walls. For children, nights could spark imaginations. The shadows of the firelight seemed to take on shapes, while the distant cry of an animal stirred both fear and wonder. Bedtime stories were not always tales of fantasy, but often family histories. Accounts of ancestors, of voyages, of lives lived in distant lands. In this way, the past lingered in the evenings, tying the present to traditions carried from afar. Of course, not all nights were peaceful. Storms rolled across the plains with sudden ferocity, lightning illuminating the landscape in brilliant flashes. The crash of thunder shook the air and rain pounded against rooftops. Families huddled together, hoping their homes would withstand the force. Other nights carried danger of a different kind, illnesses that struck suddenly, or threats from strangers on the road. In such moments, darkness could feel overwhelming. But on most evenings, once chores were done and lamps extinguished, the frontier night returned to stillness. Silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of nature, wrapped itself around the land. Sleep came gradually under skies vast and unbroken. To rest in the West was to sleep within a world both harsh and beautiful, where each night was a reminder of how closely lives were tied to nature's rhythms. Imagine yourself there, lying in a small cabin bed. The quilt is heavy, the room dim except for a faint glow from dying embers. Outside, the night spreads endlessly, the stars burning bright above. You listen to the quiet, the slow breathing of those nearby, the faint rustle of wind. Slowly, your thoughts soften, drifting with the rhythm of this place. The hardships of the day fades, and you sink into the kind of rest that only comes when the world outside is so vast, so silent, and so full of stars. As we near the end of our journey through the Wild West, it is worth pausing to reflect. The frontier has often been remembered in stories of adventure, of outlaws and gunfights, of cowboys racing across open plains. But the quieter truth, the one lived each day by countless people, was not a tale of spectacle. It was a story of endurance, of survival in a land that demanded strength, patience, and resilience. For settlers, every day brought work, building shelter from rough timber, tending animals, coaxing food from stubborn soil, hauling water, cooking, sewing, mending. These tasks filled the hours. The romantic image of the West often fades when one considers the unending labor it required. There were no shortcuts, no modern conveniences. Life was built step by step, effort by effort. Survival meant not a single act of bravery, but the quiet persistence of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. And yet there was beauty woven into the struggle. The land itself, vast and untamed, offered a kind of wonder that softened hardship. To see the sunrise spread over the plains, to watch storms sweep across distant mountains, to walk beneath a night sky filled with stars. These moments reminded settlers why they endured. The West was harsh, but it was also magnificent, and those who lived there carried both truths within them. We might think of survival as merely the absence of failure, but on the frontier, it was more than that. It was the ability to adapt. Families learned to make use of every resource, to stretch food supplies through winter, to craft tools from what was at hand. They learned from indigenous peoples, who had centuries of knowledge about the land's rhythms and gifts. They leaned on one another, forming communities where neighbors shared labor, food, and protection. Alone, survival was tenuous. Together, it was possible. The frontier was also a place of diversity, where people from many cultures and backgrounds left their mark. African American cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers, European immigrants, indigenous families, all faced challenges. All contributed in ways that shaped the identity of the West. Survival was not only individual but collective, carried on by this wide and varied mix of people. Of course, survival often came with loss. Illness swept through towns, accidents claimed lives, and conflicts left scars. Families who set out with hope did not always find the future they sought. The harshness of the land could not be ignored. To survive meant to accept that life was fragile, that each day was a gift not guaranteed. Perhaps this awareness gave the frontier its particular intensity, a constant reminder of both risk and possibility. And yet, despite all, people found ways to create meaning. They planted gardens, not only for food but for beauty. They built schools and churches, determined to pass on knowledge and faith. They celebrated harvests, sang songs, and told stories. In these acts, survival became more than endurance. It became living, shaping a life worth more than the sum of its difficulties. Imagine, for a moment, a small cabin at the edge of a town. The day's work is done. A lantern glows softly, and a family sits together. Bread is passed, soup is shared. Outside, the prairie stretches into the darkness, but inside there is warmth, companionship, and rest. It is a modest scene, yet it holds the essence of frontier survival, not triumph over nature, but harmony with it, not endless struggles, but small victories carried forward each day. Looking back, it is tempting to measure the West by its myths, the quick draw, the lone heroes, the sudden clash. But survival was slower, quieter. It was the steady rhythm of hands at work, of communities supporting one another, of people adjusting to a land that asked much and gave little without persistence. The true strength of the frontier lay not in its legends, but in its ordinary lives, lived with determination and care. As our exploration draws to a close, we might reflect on what the West still offers us today. Not just a vision of wide landscapes and rugged freedom, but a lesson in endurance. In remembering the settlers, the indigenous peoples, the immigrants, and all who struggled there, we see that survival is not only about strength of body, but also of spirit, the willingness to keep going, to adapt, to find meaning even in hardship. Picture the final moments of a frontier day. The fire burns low. The sky outside is vast, the stars countless. Within the cabin, the family sleeps, their breath slow and steady. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, but for now, there is peace. This is survival too. The ability to rest, to find stillness even in a life filled with challenge. So the story of the Wild West ends not with a bang, but with a quiet truth. It was never easy. It was never simple, but it was real. A place of harsh tests and enduring beauty, where people carried on one sunrise and one sunset at a time. And as we leave this story, we carry with us its lesson, that survival is not only about reaching the end, but about living fully in each moment along the way.